Thank you for listening to Mormon Sex Info. This episode is an archived episode and is only now becoming publicly available. Mormon Sex Info relies on contributions. To contribute, please visit mormonsex.info. And now, please enjoy this episode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast. I am your co-host, John Dehlin, and today we're doing something almost heretical. We're doing an episode without Margie Dehlin.
It does feel heretical. That's such a good word.
Is it sinful? Is it heretical?
It's
what is it? What are we doing here?
It's apostate-like.
It's apostate-like.
Yeah.
I
miss her already.
What's that?
I miss her already. It's just like me and you. Like
I know. I feel
like
lonely.
the lame ones.
I feel a little bit naked. Which is appropriate for today's topic. So I am here, of course, with the lovely, the talented, the brilliant, the wise, the experienced Natasha Parker. Natasha, welcome.
Thank you, John. I am here with the lovely, lonely, very kind, smart, witty John Dehlin.
Margie's in Vermont and enjoying a vacation and her family, and I'm holding down the fort. So I get a little sense for what it's like. Margie's always holding down the fort for me. Now I'm holding down the fort for her.
That's good. That's a good thing to do for each other.
It is good. Okay, well, we're going to do a special episode on a special topic, and it's one that Natasha has a lot of experience in for well over a decade, probably 2 decades now. And we're just going to dive right in today without a lot of announcements, I think. Are there any announcements you want to make, Natasha?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Do we want to just talk really fast about, I have a September faith transition event coming up in September. So if people want to sign up for that, it's going to be in Oklahoma City. But I need to have so many people signed up for it before I'll hold it. So we probably need to get on that. If people are interested, I probably need to know by August.
Yeah, so go to mormonfaithcrisis.com/events if you want to attend the Oklahoma City workshop. The dates are September 13th through 14th, and you can find all that information on the website. But Natasha does great work. She's inspired, and check it out. If anybody's listening, it's July 9th. Tomorrow night, July 10th, Margie and I will be presenting Community of Christ for 3 hours on the topic of parenting and conscious parenting after a Mormon Faith Crisis. It's a free workshop, 7 to 10, Community of Christ building, and we're really excited about that. And we may have another Thrive in the works coming soon. But we won't talk about that now. But we're really excited about it. All right, so I guess we should always begin with our kind of mission and our theme and why we do this. Natasha, do you have that handy, or should I pull it up?
I don't have it handy, but let me see if I can remember it.
Okay, go for it.
There's 3 P's.
Yes, the 3 P's.
We want to be practical. We want to be
positive. And personal.
Yay!
Positive, practical, and personal tips for navigating a Mormon faith crisis.
Yes.
Or for those wishing to understand those in faith crisis. So we want this podcast to be friendly for both those going through a faith crisis, but also the faithful people who are trying to understand it. And it's fitting. Natasha's still an active attending member of the church on her own terms, of course, and I'm not. But we want everyone to feel safe listening to this. And what's our message about a faith crisis, Natasha?
Well, we called it the gift of the Mormon faith crisis because in a lot of ways, even though change is hard and oftentimes very painful, and faith transitions are very painful, they hit kind of at the core of a lot of our identity and lifestyle and family relationships. And yet, beautiful things come out of change, and beautiful things come out of shifts and new perspectives. And I think that's true of wherever you are on the spectrum, whether you're the one going through the faith transition or you're the one supporting somebody in faith transition, as I work with mixed faith couples and I work with mixed faith families, I often hear from all sides that, no, we probably wouldn't want to go back to the way it was before because of all the things that we have benefited from and having to renegotiate and recalibrate and improve. We've seen improvements in the intimacy and the ability and the quality of our relationships in our lives. So there's a lot of positives that come out of pain. And isn't that kind of a Mormon construct in of itself? I mean, that's kind of the story within Mormonism, is this idea that we're here to experience things, and we're not always sure what we're going to experience, but we know that pain is part of it, and we know that joy is part of it. And that's a very Mormon kind of way of looking at things. And I think faith crises sometimes people don't think of it in that terms. We expect problems to be things that are not faith crisis related, but I think it very much fits that bill.
Absolutely. And I feel like a faith crisis is just a stage of life that basically it's a chance to deepen and your perspectives in life, to become stronger, to have better relationships. And it's something that isn't just a Mormon thing. If you read Richard Rohr, who's a kind of a Catholic, coach or therapist around people having a faith crisis in Catholicism, he's studied all different religious traditions and has found that it's just normal to go through a faith crisis if you're alive and if you're paying attention. So we're not pathologizing it. We're actually here to say it's an incredible opportunity.
Yeah.
So we're glad you guys have joined us. And we have a really important and a sensitive topic today. It's one that we've covered a lot on Mormon Stories podcast, which I've hosted. And of course, you, Natasha, have covered this a lot on your various outlets and channels, which are what?
I have the Mormon Sex Info podcast. I have Mormon Mental Health podcast, both of which have talked about sexuality a lot. And I have my website, natashaparker.org. And I've also been doing quite a few webinars and things available on the sextalkwithnatasha.com website.
Yeah. And so I know for a fact there's no greater sex expert within Mormonism than Natasha. No one's been doing it longer. No one's been doing it more intensely. No one's probably counseled more couples. Very few are actually licensed. And this is something that comes with a lot of experience and passion for you. And that's why I'm so honored. I'm going to play the role of kind of interviewer today, and you'll be kind of the expert. And since I have studied a thing or two, I do have a degree in psychology, I'll throw some things in my experience. And I have personal experience in this topic as well. But this is a topic that affects people everywhere, not just Mormons, but couples everywhere, individuals. Let's go back, and I'm just going to start by asking you some questions. Is that okay, Natasha?
Yeah. And for sure, pipe in, because I'm not the only expert in all of this. But you're right. I've been very passionate about it for a very long time because I've been working with Mormons who've been very upset about these topics. So I've been caring about this issue for, over 15 years for sure, really looking into this topic.
So what is, let's just have you explain to begin, what has been historically the church's approach to masturbation and pornography? How would you describe it?
Well, there's some interesting thoughts about their history with masturbation. Mark Milan, by the way, has done an excellent job at doing a kind of overview of the history of masturbation. That paper it's like decades old now, but it's very good. And I was lucky enough to find that article.
Context?
Yeah. It's from the history of when masturbation kind of became a sin that we started talking about, because it wasn't something that was talked about like in Joseph and Smith's time or Young's time or anything like that. It was more like in the 60s, 70s that started being an issue. So anyway, really interesting read there. And but I think in general, for the amount of time that we all have been members of the church, you know, if you're like in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or younger than that, both masturbation and, of course, anything pornographic has been considered dire sin. And to the point that it's, you know, usually when I read articles and see the things that have come over the pulpit, it's what I would call very provocative language that is used to describe these types of sins. So, you know, perverse, evil, destructive, horrible, you know, in the grasps of Satan's clutches. I know Ted Callister gave a talk where he gave this imagery of like an octopus's tentacles coming to get you. There was like a video not too long ago that, you know, talked about kind of encouraging BYU students to turn in their roommates if they knew they were masturbating or looking at erotic adult materials, kind of as part of like helping them, which of course I think crosses immense boundaries and is very harmful in of itself of advice. Anyway, you know, and it's been really interesting to watch the spectrum of sexuality, you know, as the internet has approached. Yes, we do have a lot more access to sexually explicit materials. That's a fact. And I think that also in this new social justice era, we have been, as a nation and as a world, becoming much more LGBTQ plus affirming. So I guess it's not super surprising that because those two things have been shifting, a lot of attention has been given to those, you know, what the church considers sins. And it's really, I think, a missed opportunity and very sad, because the reality is that we do have a lot of sexual problems. We have a lot of sexual crime. We have a lot of things in society that we could be addressing from a sexual lens. And it's not masturbation and pornography. And yet, because we've seen these cultural shifts, it's like the leaders haven't been able to move away from those, from focusing on those types of issues versus the much more serious issues, which have to do with sexual abuse and sexual assault and sexual trauma and things that are happening and have happened for decades, for millennia, forever. And yet you never see the amount of energy and time spent on those issues that affect so many of us as you do these kind of periphery issues that I think just fall under kind of, for the most part, normative human behavior.
Yeah, so let me dig into that a bit, and I'll paint a little bit of a picture. I think, you know, if our audience is people new to a faith crisis or going through one, and even their believing family and friends, my sense is they're going to have a very different view, which is the same view that I grew up with and held for a long time. And I'll just try and restate it, which is that, you know, sex is sacred, that sex is to be only had between a man and a woman. It's that anything that arouses, and I think this is from the Strength of the Youth pamphlet, anything that arouses the passions, especially outside of marriage, is sort of going to be pushing you towards being a sexually active creature before you're supposed to be, which is after you make your covenants in the temple with your opposite sex spouse. And so for a teen to be masturbating, it's dirty, it's private, it's seedy, especially pornography is involved, and it can lead to being gay, it can lead to abuse, it can lead to just bad behaviors, and then most importantly, it can get you, as Boyd K. Packer wrote in his Little Factories talk, it can get your sex factory going, so that then you are more likely to act out either with opposite sex or the same sex in some way sexual. And we know that in Mormonism historically, extramarital sex is a sin next to murder. And so So there's all of that, and that's for, teens primarily. And then there's the issue with adults, which is with adults, your sex is for you and you're supposed to be married when you're an adult and married to the opposite sex. And then once you're married, you're supposed to have sex with your partner. And that's when you have sex. You don't have sex with yourself. You don't have sex with other people. And pornography for an adult is betrayal. It's cheating on your partner. It is it's a lack of mastery. It's a violation of your sacred covenants. It's a moral failure, and it's dirty and it's perverse, and it's an insult and a betrayal to your partner, and that's kind of how I think many Mormons see it. I think that's the church's general position these days. And then what as a result, my understanding is the church would say to a teen, you can't take the sacrament if you're masturbating and looking at porn because you're not worthy. You can't enter the temple if you're masturbating or looking at porn. You probably should go to some sort of 12-step program that the church is a sponsor of, or they have these service missionaries that will teach you the many of the principles developed at Alcoholics Anonymous, kind of with the gospel twist. And you'll start talking about yourself in terms of addiction, in terms of sobriety, in terms of, again, being an addict. And you may even go to special therapists or even therapeutic centers for addiction, the same types of ones that eating disorder people would go to, people with eating disorders that, drug and alcohol addicts would go to. You would go to a similar type of set because, and again, I think this is the porn kills love sort of view, or the fight the new drug view, which is that, and they will show imaging scans of the brain and the parts of the brain that light up, and they will try and tell you that masturbation and pornography is a lot like, it basically activates the same centers in the brain as cocaine and heroin, and so it needs to be treated like an addiction, just like heavy drugs and alcohol. So you need to go to an addiction center for recovery from this addiction, because it's just all really serious and you're not worthy and you're kind of a dirty, bad person if you do these things. And am I overstating it?
No, you sure are not. That's pretty much where we're coming from.
So, from a believing Mormon's perspective, if the prophet says it, it's true. And the prophets this is all kind of what the prophets have been saying and doing for decades. If it's revelation, this is what God thinks and feels. This is definitely incorporated into bishops' interviews, stake presidents' interviews, worthiness interviews. This is all tied to temple mission service and temple service. And so it must be the way God thinks and the way God wants it if that's the way it is in the church. And that, obviously if you're going through a faith crisis, you're going to be confused about that. But that's kind of a really strong, compelling mindset. And if I can just raise the stakes even a tiny bit higher, as a therapist at Utah State University for 6 years, I saw how pre-missionaries and post-missionaries and even missionaries were tormented over this shaming and guilt around pornography and masturbation, to the point of either severe depression and anxiety. I've had some who have had thoughts of self-mutilation as a way to solve this problem because they're unable to solve it. And I've even heard of attempts at suicide, or even actual successful completions of suicide as a result of people being so tormented over this issue. And not to mention in the married realm, husbands and sometimes wives being deeply shamed over their engagement in this activities, again, to the point of severe stress on the marriage, sometimes even divorce and the fracturing of a family, and not to mention the severe mental illness sort of ramifications of this approach. Again, Natasha, am I overstating that in your expert?
No, you're not overstating at all. And it is, I mean, it's why I've been so passionate about this work for so long, because I see all these things that you're talking about, and it's excruciating as somebody who's trying to help somebody in wellness and mental health. And, when you think about a therapeutic approach, it's all about framing things and watching the ways that we think and trying to recalibrate ways that we think that are unhealthy. A lot of that is, cognitive behavioral therapies are about reframing and taking your thoughts to task, right? And kind of seeing, is there evidence for these thoughts, and why do I have this negative self-dialogue? And so what's unfortunately kind of a dilemma that we're all in while we're parts of religious communities is that in some areas, and I would say sexuality is definitely one of those areas, what is coming out of social science and mental health kind of studies and research and treatment is contraindicated with what's coming out of religious leaders from, religious sects that are more traditional conservative. There's not every religion out there, or every pastor out there, or every bishop has these necessarily negative views, but in general, Mormon background fits into that. And so what is being told and what is being said is coming from not only a leader, but from God themselves, is contraindicated to good sexual health and sexual intimacy. So that puts people in a real dilemma, and it puts also mental health professionals in a dilemma, because we're always trying to do that kind of, respecting people's values and respecting their beliefs and respecting where they're coming from as far as a spiritual construct. And yet we have, information or knowledge about certain things from a scientific medical perspective that are at odds with those values and beliefs. And the stories that we tell are very powerful, So to your point, yes, people do become depressed. People do suicide. People do divorce. People do see this as infidelity, not because people are stupid, because people are part of a system where the story, where the narrative, where the script has been, that's the way you respond to this. This is serious enough that that's how you should respond to this. So people are, in a sense, doing a very good job of living out the stories that we provide in a Mormon construct in regards to sexuality. And I guess before we even go further, what I'd like to just spend a minute on here, because I think sometimes when I present, it's difficult because I want to give accurate information, and at the same time, I don't want to minimize very legitimate pain, right? So I'm not by any means trying to say, oh, if you're a spouse who has felt cheated on because your partner has been looking at porn, oh, that's a silly thing, you shouldn't be feeling that way. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think that's a very legitimate feeling. I think it is devastating, especially when you feel like something is happening without your knowledge and secrecy, kind of against the entire contract or understanding that you have about what your marriage should look like or what it should be about. I think that if you're dealing with self-shame about these issues, again, it's what we've taught you to feel. And so part of faith transitioning is making room for new stories, new interpretations, new ways of having a relationship with certain aspects of your life. And I would say sexuality is definitely an area where we want to do a lot of that work. And even some of the things that you kind of stereotypically brushed with a big brush doesn't mean that, every bishop out there, stops people from taking the sacrament because they're masturbating or stops people from going to the temple. I mean, there's a wide range even within Mormon circles as to how serious these things are treated or what the narratives are. But in general, and I say in general because I look at top down, the top leadership has been very rigid and very serious and very dour about the language and the consequences, about anything that doesn't fall into what you very adeptly pictured as the ideal sexual way of being, which we know is not how humans work. It's not. So if you want to have that picture, that ideal picture that the Mormon narrative gives about how to be a sexual being, we're all going to fail at that. All of us are going to fail at that. And so if you have a system where everybody's failing in one way or another, it's just going to be a recipe kind of for disaster and shame. And this is when we're talking about sexual shame and sexual negativity, this is what we're talking about. And if you don't think that this has impacted you, it has. I mean, there's just no way to get around not having had this impact you in some way or another. Even if you don't feel like you're having issues in how you perceive other people and how you perceive a potential partner or your partner. And it's a recipe for secrecy because we don't feel safe in really sharing and being open with ourselves and with others. And it's a recipe for decreased intimacy because there's a lot of shoulds and parameters on how you can be together instead of actually being together. So it's devastatingly sad for me to see the amount of pain and sadness. And the research shows that we, coming from religiously conservative systems, are a vulnerable population for these kinds of narratives. That we are much more higher, we're much higher vulnerable to the sex addiction kind of narrative, for example. We're much higher vulnerable to the infidelity type of narrative. We are much higher vulnerable for rates of divorce for this particular issue. And we're much highly vulnerable for depression, anxiety, OCD issues and all of that in regards to self-shame when it comes to dealing with the natural drive of sexuality that we all have in one way, shape, or another that's just kind of wired within us, whether that's our frequency or our libido or our erotic preferences, the things that turn us on. Those things are just kind of wired within us, and we're constantly at battle with ourselves or with our partner's self. And so it's really a recipe for disaster.
Amen. And just a few framings from my perspective before we really dive in. For believers and even liberal progressive believers, how do we square the fact that the church has been teaching X approach to pornography and masturbation for decades, and now Natasha and John and the whole world of mental health pretty much, and anyone who knows anything about kind of mental health and well-being who's kind of, considered legitimate in 2019 is sort of holding a different view. And I'll say that I'm sure there are exceptions in the field just like there are anywhere. But is it fair to say it's kind of a mainstream view in the mental health field that the way that religions have been approaching masturbation and pornography hasn't been healthy? Is that fair to kind of stereotype or to summarize it in that way?
Yeah, I think in masturbation, it's definitely true. I mean, the American Pediatric Association came out decades ago normalizing masturbation, especially for children and adolescents. So that's been, I think, in the mainstream for a long time. Pornography is a different issue. I think that there is a lot of taboo around sexually explicit materials. And quite frankly, we live in a country, especially in the red states, like one that I'm in, where there are, I think, a lot of biases that mental health professionals aren't necessarily challenging themselves sufficiently on. So you have people that are licensed and clinical practitioners and do, I would think, a fairly good job in most areas. And yet when it comes to sexuality, they inadvertently also hold on to some shaming narratives. And the sex addiction field definitely falls into that. People who are sex addiction specialists tend to come from social work, marriage and family therapy backgrounds, professional counseling backgrounds. So they're actually very adept at many things, but they've not necessarily gotten what I would consider correct training in this particular area of how they work with people. And I see that bias a lot in Kansas, where I live, with Christian therapists, evangelical therapists. So there is, I think, a problem in that regard with professionals, and it's a big dialogue that's happening in our kind of professional circles today. Now, I would say in the sex field, if you've actually studied sexology and become certified with ASECT or gone through any type of formal process, those professionals would all be on the same page for sure. Yes.
Yeah, and within Orthodox Mormonism, it's just so simple and elegant and easy to say that God talks to prophets and then prophets tell us what's up. And that's easy and it's simple, and or at least it appears that way. And so then we just do what the prophets tell us. One of the opportunities that progressive and post-Mormonism provides, or a faith crisis, is to realize that that is not kind of really the way it works. If you just look at the scientific realm, whether it's the age of the earth, Noah's Ark, organic, evolution, all sorts of different, scientific realms, even the idea that the earth, revolves around the sun versus the sun around the earth. If you go back in time, what you'll find is that religions tend to be conservative organizations that tend to want to preserve. So whatever has been going on in the past, religion, the default gravity or inertia or momentum in a religion is to always preserve what's in the past. And so often what's preserved in the past we think is God's revelation, but really it's just conservative social mores of the times. And so there are all sorts of issues, age of the earth, polygamy, just all sorts of conservative elements of religiosity we just carry forward. So we hate evolution. We're suspicious of science. We cling to the things that our parents and our grandparents taught us out of safety. But then when science comes along and really educates us, shows us that the earth is billions of years old, shows us that Noah's Ark couldn't have possibly happened, shows us that evolution is accepted by all scientists as the way that life evolved. Thus, a literal Adam and Eve figure who existed 6,000 years ago couldn't have happened because we've got multiple strains of humanity existing for tens or hundreds of thousands of years before the timeline that the Bible would allow for Adam and Eve to have been the first humans. Then we have to adjust. And pretty much in every case when science and religion have come up against each other, it really has been science that won and religion retreated. And that's not bad. That's just the way it works. And religion still has an important place in humanity. It still provides important structures, and we've covered a lot of that here on the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis. But this really in part is just a matter of science, and it's a matter of paying attention. And that doesn't mean that the church leaders don't have value, that they're never inspired. It just means that we have to become flexible and realize that sometimes Mormon church leaders get it wrong. A really clear example of that is the story of oral sex and the bishop's memo. Do you want to tell that story really quick, Natasha?
Yeah, well, back in the 80s, there was a memo that came out, I guess, to bishops and stake presidents that, was stating that oral sex was an unholy practice and that married couples should be dissuaded, from enjoying oral sex as a marital dyad. And I think my understanding of that, I wasn't married or really very much of an adult when that happened, so I'm not too aware, but my understanding is that didn't go over very well. And, after like 6 months of pushback from bishops saying we're not comfortable asking people about oral sex, and maybe a lot of people didn't even agree with that, it just kind of went by the wayside. What the church doesn't do well is it doesn't own when it makes a mistake, right? And so it doesn't want to admit that it makes mistakes, because somehow I think it feels like if it does that, it depletes its people's confidence that they're inspired to begin with. And so they just kind of have it go to the wayside without really announcing, oh, by the way, this thing that some of you have been affected by the way, because some bishops did ask married couples about that and did say that that was an unholy practice and that they shouldn't be doing those things. It's something I always ask about. If I see any couple like 45 or older, I ask about that because it still shows up a lot in my practice that they're functioning under that type of shame and sadness about a part of their marital life that nobody had any business interfering with, and so, but the church doesn't own it. They don't apologize for it. They don't reverse course. And so then those who are affected by those narratives keep them, and those who aren't, move on. But I think it's very tragic for the many, thousands and thousands of couples that felt like they had to hone in their marital sexual activity in regards to something as normative and beautiful for many as oral sex is. Oral sex is not something that everybody enjoys, but a majority of people enjoy that. And I think it's just devastating that that the church interfered in so many marriages in that very inappropriate and I'll say even abusive way. I mean, it's abusive when you get in the way of people's normal, natural, sexual relationships, and start making sins out of things that are just normal, because then we see ourselves as broken, we see ourselves as dirty or perverse or wrong or inappropriate, when in reality you have
our partners as you're perverse,
right?
or unworthy, right?
Right. And I think about, young couples who are excited, who've done everything. This is what's so maddening to me is that Mormon people, for the most part, and even Jana Reese's recent book on kind of statistics around sexuality shows that a lot of Mormons do wait until they're married or do have a lot of strong sexual values. And so we're not talking about harming people that are kind of like on the fringe and, doing things that maybe most of us would still think is taboo. We're talking about very mainstream, good, righteous, active, beautiful couples that love each other, that enjoy their intimacy, and yet they have these parameters and these rigid kind of things that have been imposed upon them, unnecessarily so, and that are being damaged by that. It's just,
right.
To me, it's just tragic.
And to the maybe meta point as well is that very edict that was given to bishops and stake presidents prohibiting oral sex was rescinded, and that just shows that the church leaders can make mistakes, even if they don't like to always be really explicit about that. Another very clear example of the church making clear mistakes in the matter of sexuality is how they've dealt with LGBTQ members and same-sex attraction. For decades and decades, and this is something I studied in my doctoral dissertation, for decades and decades, the church's approach to masturbation, to homosexuality was, it's a sin to even have the thoughts or the feelings of being gay or lesbian or bisexual. Same-sex sexuality, homosexuality can be cured through going to a therapist and doing reparative therapy. One of the ways it can be cured is by marrying someone of the opposite sex, and that will cure you. And so tens of thousands of Mormon couples were counseled by their bishops to enter into mixed orientation marriages that almost always ended catastrophically, with children often as collateral damage.
And in secret, I will add, most men were told not to tell their wives.
Absolutely.
Or potential wives that they were having those kinds of feelings.
Yep. And all that reparative therapy stuff led to severe instances of anxiety and depression and many instances of suicidality. And we all know about the LGBTQ epidemic, suicide epidemic that's been happening for years. And also the church would had the position for decades that same-sex sexuality is a choice, or it's a result of abuse or sin. but that it's not biological. And Boyd K. Packer has the famous quote, "Why would a loving Heavenly Father do that to anyone?" Meaning, why would God ever make anyone gay? And what I can say positively in 2019 is the church has backtracked on all those issues. They haven't come out with the General Conference talk and said we were wrong. But if you look at their messages on the Mormons and Gays website, if you look at their rhetoric around same-sex sexuality, it's 180-degree reverse from what it was just 10 years ago. It's not a sin to have same-sex attraction anymore. They don't recommend, overtly at least, explicitly, reparative therapy or conversion therapy. The group Evergreen, that was the church's, reparative therapy organization, has been disassembled. The church no longer recommends that you enter into a mixed orientation marriage as a way to cure yourself of being gay, even though they still celebrate mixed orientation marriages, which for me is a problem. And the church is even willing to now concede that there is a biological basis for homosexuality. So again, we've got a really critical domain of sexuality where for decades and decades and decades, the church got it wrong, harmed hundreds of thousands of people, and fortunately paid attention enough to science to the point where they've reversed almost every one of those damaging teachings. The only sort of little step they have to go is in just saying that homosexuality is a normal variant of human sexual behavior, which it is, and that's what the scientific community would say. It's a normal variant of human sexual behavior. And then to just celebrate same-sex relationships, and if they want to just solely celebrate monogamous, committed, legal same-sex relationships, there are millions of us who would celebrate that concession. But it's just, so that's the one point I wanted to make, is that as much as we respect much of what Mormon Church and Mormon Church leaders have done and do, they do get it wrong on science, and especially on science and sexuality. And we hope you can understand that as you're trying to reconsider a more healthy view. The only second point I wanted to make before we dive in is that what I'm concerned about as a mental health professional and as someone who counsels couples and individuals on this on a weekly basis, I'm concerned about what's effective, right? So I'll give you an example. If there's a religious policy that leads to severe depression and suicide, then I think in and of itself, that must not be the best policy. That policy must need improvement. If a policy damages a marriage, if it makes married couples who otherwise would have been relatively happy and healthy, if it makes them hate each other and want to divorce each other and disrespect each other, in other words, a policy is destroying families or intimacy between couples, I see that as a problem because I value marriages and healthy relationships. And I think the final thing I'd say is that if a policy actually increases the behavior that it claims to abhor, in other words, if a policy increases one's frequency of masturbation, and it actually increases one's usage of pornography as it denounces masturbation and pornography, then I think for sure that policy is ineffective and harmful. And I think we might be able to make the case, and in my decade or more of experience dealing with this issue, I would say that in many, many cases, the historical policy on porn and masturbation within Mormonism actually for many people leads to an increase of masturbation and pornography use simultaneous as the church denounces it and encourages people to go into these addiction recovery programs.
Absolutely.
Natasha,
absolutely. It's called the anxiety feedback loop. I mean, there's like a name for it.
Yeah.
So, the more anxious you are, the more upset you are, the more shamed you feel about something. Well, guess what our bodies are wired to do? Our bodies are wired to soothe ourselves because, we are wired to prevent pain and stress and negative emotions. So in that moment, you will usually lean into whatever that thing is that helps you feel better. And pornography and masturbation are excellent ways to help you feel better in the moment, just like gambling does, and just like eating donuts does, and just like yelling at our kids does. I mean, in the moment, it can feel very good and stress relieving to do something, even if it goes against your values. And so the more that we have upped the ante on shame and anxiety and punishment and public shame, you know, because these things become, even though we want to say these things are confidential, if you're not taking the sacrament, your wife or your husband or your parent notices that, or your
friend.
Or
if you can't go to the temple, right? Or if you can't go on a mission, if you can't go on your mission, right?
Exactly. These things become public shaming events, very, very dire public shaming events. And so, so your anxiety now is much higher than it was before. And these approaches that are punitive and shaming and increase that anxiety feedback loop. And so your inability, and that's why it's fallen into this kind of, why so many people think it falls into this addiction realm. Well, it's something that I just come back to and that I can't stop, and that it's not necessarily addiction to be in a feedback anxiety loop. And it can feel that way. It can feel out of control. It can feel like you're doing something that goes against everything you want to be doing. And that's true of many human behaviors. But again, we tend to hone in on sexual behaviors much more so than we do any other behaviors. And like I said, we even hone in on normative sexual behaviors much more so than we do criminal and horrible sexual behaviors that we should be focusing on more. So it's just an interesting phenomenon. And again, you know, to your point, I think that we have within our scriptures, by the fruit ye shall know it. And to your point, if the fruit shows anxiety, depression, suicidality, divorce, shame,
and an increase in pornography and masturbation use,
the fruit is rotten, right? And so I think what we also want to be very careful in saying is that John and I are not like, anything goes and go do whatever, free love, you know. We are very much, both John and I feel very strongly about this word values, you know, having values. And what values mean is, how do you want to conduct yourself in life, and what do you value? And do you value monogamy? Do you value the sacredness of a sexual relationship? Do you value, having mutual pleasure with your partner? Do you value making sure, you know, you're being consensual? And there's so many wonderful values that you can incorporate into a sexual narrative and a sexual script that are healthy, that do propel you to act and behave and feel good about yourself and feel good about how you interact with other people. So we are not by any means trying to say anything goes and go do whatever, and it's too bad we were shamed, and, you know, who cares about anybody but yourself. That's not the message here. The message is there's a correct way to go about talking about values and sexual sacredness that is helpful to people, and there's ways that it isn't. And unfortunately, what we see as mental health professionals is that the majority of the approach has really ignored the sex-positive messages that we have within Mormonism, and has unfortunately focused on some very harmful practices that I think most of us have been affected by.
Amen. And so even if you're not compelled by the science, even if you are not, your mind isn't changed about the sinfulness or the damage or the harm of masturbation and pornography, as two people who have counseled as many or more people than anyone else sort of in this field over the past 10 years, we would ask you to at least consider, effectiveness, that you care about your loved ones. You don't want them having major anxiety and depression disorders. You don't want them suicidal. You don't want them actually increasing the behavior that you want to extinguish. And so we're offering you a more effective approach to masturbation and pornography. And I can attest, let me just tell a quick story. I had a client at Utah State University a few years back who had an extreme bishop. And this extreme bishop basically said, he asked this client of mine if the client looked at, masturbated and looked at pornography. And the client said he did. So the bishop said, okay, you can't take the sacrament. So this kid's going to college with all these other, men and women. And when the sacrament comes, he's got to pass the tray, and he's feeling just the eyes of shame upon him while everyone's wondering why he's passing the sacrament and not taking it. When there's a ward temple night in his ward, he's not able to go to the temple. And so all his friends are like, hey, you go to the temple with us? And he's like, I can't. And of course, he's feeling more heaped on shame. It got to the point where he was actually, masturbating, looking at porn more than what he had been when he first went to the bishop. And so the bishop's like, well, this is getting really serious, not realizing that the intervention was part of the problem. So the bishop actually told my client, what I need you to do is text me at the end of every night. And I want you to tell me whether you masturbated or not.
Oh my goodness.
And so this kid, didn't want to lie to the Lord and lie to the bishop. And so every night, all day long, it'd be like, I can't masturbate. Oh, I can't masturbate. Oh. So he's thinking about it all the time, trying not to think about it, trying not to shame himself in front of his bishop. And so inevitably, he would masturbate, and then he would have to tell the bishop that night he masturbated. It got to the point where he came in and reported to me that he was injuring himself masturbating so much. So we're talking bruises and pain and dysfunction in his genitals because this intervention that was supposed to be inspired by a bishop who is a voice mouthpiece for the Lord was actually making him look at porn and masturbate to the point of injuring himself. And that's when I just realized, oh my gosh, the cure is part of the poison in this case. And then I can also flip it. I can flip it and say that I've had many, many clients who lived for decades in shame over privately, occasionally masturbating or looking at porn. When they came out about it to their spouse, when their spouse got a healthy view about it, when it became normalized, when it was no longer shameful, when it was no longer taboo, guess what happened to the frequency of their masturbation and pornography use? Can anyone guess? Natasha, do you want to guess?
It lowers.
It lowers.
Yeah.
Once the spouse said, hey, I love you no matter what. You're not bad. You're not broken. How can we talk about sexuality in a healthy way? How can you no longer feel shame? And then how can we just have a healthier sex life together? Miracle of miracles. The person all of a sudden is thinking about masturbation less. They're feeling less shame and guilt. They're having a better sex life with their partner. And so all of a sudden their interest in masturbation declines and their interest in pornography can decline. Not always to the point of it disappearing completely. And we might even talk about whether it should. But the point is that if you really care about the results, which is a healthy, happy individual, whether it's a youth or an adult, a healthy, happy partner, a healthy, happy marriage, what we're telling you is from our feet on the ground experience, the approach that we're about to teach you is actually going to be the most effective approach to dealing with masturbation.
Yes.
Pornography.
Well, and I could second that story with so many clients, John. I mean, I think what really got me to finally write a post on my Mormon therapist blog about masturbation was I could not handle one more virgin teenager coming into my office. These are the kids, right? I mean, this is what's even more upsetting about it is that the kids who are like kind of able to roll their eyes at all of us, older people, including their bishop, they're not going in and saying, oh yeah, I masturbated. Right? They're like, I'm not going to tell anybody about that. Yeah. And they go to the temple trips and they pass the sacrament and they take the sacrament and they could care less. And they're not allowing necessarily that shame to infiltrate. Or they are, but they're still doing it in secret, right? So they're not putting themselves out there, so they can still be internalized shame about that. The kids who suffer the most about this are the ones who are most likely to obey. And, they go in and they, like you're saying, they tell the bishop every single time, and they do these continual confessionals. And I had probably, I can't even count how many teenagers in my office who were actually self-injuring. I'm talking about, cutting, burning, tearing out their hair, due to the anxiety of having had masturbated. Even just masturbation, forget porn, just the masturbation piece. Several young women in my office in that position around masturbation have never had a serious relationship with a boy, have never done anything sexually with a boy, and yet they were telling me, they were giving me the scripture of the sin next to murder because they had masturbated, and the shame that they felt around that was leading to, horrific consequences in their mental health. So I finally said, I can't do this anymore. I have to speak up. And I wrote my blog on the Mormon Therapist, which I knew my relationship with the church would change the minute I hit publish on that blog. And it did. Because for the first time, I published something that the church wouldn't agree with from my area of expertise, which is not their area of expertise. And they've done so much damage. And, I used to say unintentionally, and now I don't even know. I mean, the research is out there. There's many of us talking about it, and they're just not listening. So I'm not even really willing to say unintentional harm at this point. It's just harm. They're just harming our teens and our young adults. And that harm carries over into our adult sexuality, and then we're impacted with internalized shame for the rest of our lives. And I can't tell you how many faith transitioners I'm working with that are really trying to recover from internalized sexual shame as they try to have better sexual relationships with their spouse and with themselves. And it's all unnecessary tragedy. To your point, John, I think you said last time, if I didn't have to see anybody about these issues, there's plenty of mental health issues that happen just because of our biology, right? I could stay plenty busy just seeing people through issues of genetic, depression, anxiety disorders, etc. But these are like issues that have come into people's lives artificially so. They're not wired into you. You've been taught this type of narrative, and it's affected you, and it's changed the way you see yourself, the way you interact with others. And now I'm in the business of helping people shift from something that was artificially, unnecessarily, tragically introduced. And that's just what burns me up.
Amen. And a couple other things that come to mind. I know of bishops and stake presidents that don't view masturbation as wrong. And in the one hand, you're going to go, oh, well, that's wonderful, right? Well, it's not if you think about the fact that that's left to the discretion of the bishop or the stake president. And there's plenty of bishops and stake presidents that are like, oh, you masturbate? Don't worry about it. Oh, you look at porn? Don't worry about it. Just, try not to do it and live your best, most righteous life. Take the sacrament. You need that for your spiritual development. Go to the temple. You need that for your spiritual development. Go on your mission. That'll be good for you. And so when we know that there's this whole host of bishops and stake presidents that don't ask that question, that don't make it an issue, and that encourage those healthy youth, then that makes all the atrocities of the youth who are shamed and tormented that much more pernicious, because we see that there's this bishop roulette, this ecclesiastical roulette that's capricious and kind of arbitrary, where some are literally shamed in front of their congregations, kept home from their missions. They feel unworthy to actually marry in the temple, so they don't even follow the gospel route and find a righteous partner to marry because they feel so unworthy that they end up really going off the deep end into a really sad and self-destructing life just because they got the wrong bishop or the wrong stake president. That makes it, extra, not only tragic, but also it's another reason. Yeah, it's unfair, but it's another reason to realize that how we're doing it is wrong, and we need to have a different approach. And we can't just, one of the gifts of the Mormon transition is you realize you can't just blindly trust your Mormon leaders, even the prophet. You can have respect for them, you can listen to them, you can hearken to their counsel, but ultimately you can't always trust them, because sometimes the council or the system that they've set up is harmful. And so that's kind of where we are. And so if you,
it's like luck of the draw if you're going to be affected in this horrific way that can take decades to recover from. I mean, it's so upsetting. I can't even hardly self-soothe right now.
And I saw Sam Young come on, and I just want to really quickly address, there's even, it's kind of like, there's this guy named Ron Popeil that had these commercials in the 80s. They were like infomercials. And it was like, but wait, there's more. If you act now, you can order the Ginsu knives and the smokeless ashtray and the, rubber cement, like there's more. Like we've talked about all the pain of this policy. There's more. Yeah, there's more. When you think about the fact that these policies have led bishops to feel okay, bishops, stake presidents, mission presidents, to grill little 12 and 13-year-old boys and girls about where they touch themselves. When, that is, some people feel like that is actually grooming young children to feel like it's okay for adults and other people to get involved in matters that should be private and sacred and your own business.
It's a form of sexual abuse is what it is.
It's a form of sexual abuse. But then also on top of that, this fascination and obsession with sexuality, you just have to look. Utah leads the nation per capita, not only in pornography use, but also in sexual abuse. And so it has to be all these stories of Joseph Bishop and of Lowell Robinson and Sterling von Wagner, and just the tens of thousands of cases of sexual abuse, of child abuse, have to stem from this toxic pathologization of healthy sexuality, and then an obsession with sexuality, and then this whole culture of learning to lie and having this double life, because some people, like you said, don't want to admit to the bishop or stake president that they look at porn. And so what they do is they just learn to lie. So they learn to have this public self that they present to the public, and then this private self, and those things diverge, and it's just never healthy to always be living one private life but one public life, feeling like you're dirty and sinful, living in the darkness, living in the shadows, acting out a form of your sexuality. And it's no surprise that we have stake presidents and sometimes even general authorities that are private sexual predators, and we have evidence of that. We have at least one general authority that was released and excommunicated as a general authority for child sex abuse. But we also have stake presidents that were secretly seeing prostitutes, that were secretly abusing their grandchildren. And I have to think that the toxic shaming environment and messages around sexuality have to contribute in a negative way, along with the lack of appropriate boundaries about thinking and talking about sexuality. That has to lead to an increase in unhealthy sexual acting out and even criminal behavior around sexuality. Do you think I'm overstating that, Natasha?
Not at all. Not at all. It's a whole nother topic, really, than what we're talking about today. But I do think that one of the issues that we have coming from a Mormon background is that from a very early age, we have not been taught appropriate sexual boundaries. And that affects people in many different ways. And that's kind of its own podcast or its own topic. But it affects consent, issues of consent. It affects issues of exploitation. It does groom people. By no means, I think the majority of bishops are doing the best they know how, and they're working under narratives and scripts, right? And so I think that it is very well intended, and yet the way that because our leaders have not really focused on being a trauma-informed congregation and church entity. They just have refused to become a trauma-informed entity. They have put very kind, loving men who are in bishop and stake president positions in very highly liable and also damaging positions, and they don't even realize the damage that they're provoking in our people. And
I think we're all victims.
Like
we're all victims, right?
Mess. It's a huge mess.
Yeah.
But we are all victims, and at the same time, I'm very comfortable at this point holding the leaders of our church accountable, because other churches have been willing to become trauma informed. I mean, I think the entire United States could say we're victims of sexual negative framings. We all come from a puritanical background. We have lots of things that over the decades and years, millennia of sex negative stuff that we're all trying to recover from. But there are peoples and groups and entities and churches that are willing to do the work necessary and willing to tap into the resources that are available through our own government. Our own government has a section that helps congregations become trauma informed. The Department of Health and Human Services offers that right now. And I know through conversations with people at the Department of Health and Human Services that our church has not been interested in participating in that. So, even though I agree that we're all victims, I do hold our leaders, the 70, the auxiliary leaders, our Relief Society presidents, our Young Women's presidents, definitely the top 15, responsible for continuing to act and inform people in ways that continue to harm us.
And so that's why we do this podcast, because we are trying to offer a better way. And if there's anything 2019 has taught us, with all the flurry of changes that Russell M. Nelson has introduced to Mormonism based on recommendations we've been making now for well over a decade on the Mormon internet, we're excited because we are optimistic that just like we've been able to provide some leadership, and when I say we, I mean many podcasts, many blogs, many writers, many scholars, many organizations, just like we've been able to provide leadership to the Mormon Church leadership on matters of church history, on same-sex sexuality, on ways to make the culture more feminist friendly, all these other ways that the church is now changing. We're humbly and gently and kindly and firmly offering a new approach, a more effective approach to masturbation and pornography. So there we have it. So we spent an hour talking about the problem. What if we now talk an hour about the solution? Does that sound okay, Natasha?
I think that would be great.
Okay. So how do we begin? How do we begin looking at sexuality and even masturbation in a healthier way? And we're going to both talk about teens and adults, even married adults, in our scope. So can you start us off with a healthy framing around sexuality / masturbation?
Okay. Well, by no means is the next hour going to be comprehensive. I'm trying to remember all the many things I've talked about on this subject. But yeah, let's start with masturbation, because I think masturbation is something that, like I said, all scientific kind of entities are very comfortable understanding that masturbation is a normal part of being a human being. We touch ourselves and find genital soothing from very, very early ages. In fact, in the womb, you can see a fetus kind of linger on their genital areas longer than other areas of their body. Those things are not necessarily sexualized. So if a young, 4-year-old or 2-year-old or even 7-year-old is touching themselves, it's not necessarily coming from a sexualized position. It's the same as sucking your thumb or, pulling on your ear or rubbing your elbow. I mean, just touch and stroking and soothing ourselves is a very normal part of being a human being. And in fact, we want lots of ways. We want diverse ways to be able to self-soothe. So masturbation is one of those things that we can actually see as an asset. And you can frame it in a sex-positive way, meaning that actually when it does become sexualized, it's a wonderful first step into our sexual exploration that does not include another person, because including another person ups the ante in social skills anxieties, potential ability for harm or pleasure. I mean, there's lots of things that can happen when you involve another person. So I think a wonderful way to reframe is, isn't it beautiful, even from a believing perspective, that Heavenly Parents would create kind of this self-sufficient system within ourselves where we can access self-soothing, where we can access ejaculation and orgasm and sexual imagination and creativity, all in the context of ourself first. Because at 12, at 10, maybe even at 14, we're not necessarily prepared to share those kinds of things, in their totality with another person. It's maybe when we start having crushes and maybe start, exploring a little bit with other people. And by the time we're 16, 18, 20, we've explored a lot more. But especially in those first few developmental years of sexual development, it's really wonderful that we have this self kind of efficient system. We don't have to rely on anybody else. Plus, it really, from the get-go, starts the conversation of consent in a very different way. Even though we can think that marital sex is sacred and isn't it beautiful that you're going to share this part of your life with another person, when we put the entirety of our sexual needs, desires, wants, and experience on another person, this is where the boundaries and consent can all of a sudden become very, very stressed, and where we actually have quite a bit of exploitation in marriages about managing high and lower libido differences within a couple. So if you can really have a sex-positive approach towards yourself in the beginning, you don't ever need to impose yourself or owe anybody anything sexually when you know how to take care of yourself. So right off the bat, we're starting on so many directions in a positive way when we can look at masturbation as a sex-positive, normal part of human development. And in fact, even with our teens, they might be out on a date, they might have a boyfriend or girlfriend. If their values are to wait until they're married to have certain types of sexual experiences like intercourse, masturbation is a wonderful way to manage the normal kind of feelings and intensity that you have after you've, kissed somebody for 10 or 15 minutes or started some small ways of sexual exploration, or maybe you are comfortable, having some type of touch or some type of exploration with a partner, like grinding or touching, breasts, or maybe even touching over clothing, but you're still not wanting necessarily to go, quote unquote, all the way. Masturbation is a wonderful way to talk to our teens about you have the access to that release without ever depending on another person for that. You can take care of your values, of your pacing, of what you're comfortable with, because you can always count on yourself. You never have to feel like you're dependent on another person for those things. So right off the bat, we've got lots of benefits to sex-positive perspectives on masturbation.
Yeah, and if I had to think a little bit about how I would summarize it, there's a reason why you want to teach sex positivity to a child from the beginning. One is so that they can develop a healthy relationship with their sexuality for their own benefit, because they're going to be having sex in their lives, and sex is a good thing ultimately, or none of us would be here, none of our children would be here, and we as a species wouldn't be here. So by default, it has to be a good thing. So we want to develop healthy sexuality on an individual basis, but then also the extent to which a human is feeling positive about sex, sexuality, and self-aware when they enter into a relationship, and ultimately a marriage if they choose to get married. They have more self-awareness. They see sex positively. They are skilled somewhat in self-knowledge and in how they think about sex, such that they will have a much healthier and happier sex life once they got married. And we all know that a healthy sex life is one of the main, benefits of a committed relationship, and it can also be one of the biggest problems in a committed relationship if it's not healthy. finances, children, and sex are kind of three of the big things that couples have stress over and sometimes end up divorcing over. So for all the reasons in the world you want, and for many others that you expressed, Natasha, you just want your kids starting with positive messages about sexuality, not negative ones.
Yes, right. And sex positivity is much larger of a concept than what we're focusing on today with masturbation and sexually explicit materials, right? So, talking about consent and body autonomy, those are all things that we can do from a very early age. And so I'm focusing mainly on this masturbation piece, but we're really talking about a topic that's much broader, that has a lot more to do than just these two topics of today.
But it's also foundational for people in a Mormon upbringing, because what are the messages we often get? Sex, don't do it. It's bad. It's wrong. Don't touch yourself. That's dirty. That's sinful. How can we get inundated with decades of negative messaging around sexuality and somehow think we're going to enter into marriage with a healthy approach to sexuality? Just the brain doesn't work that way. Too many negative associations. It's how hard, it's impossible to cut off and rewire all those negative messages just on the wedding night.
Absolutely.
Many men and women take years, if not decades, to reprogram their brain to all of a sudden think that their body is good, that their pleasure, that sexual pleasure is good, and that they can enjoy sex, and that sex should be something that contributes to your mental health and strengthens your relationship. But all of that begins with sex positive messaging to children and to teenagers. And it can all be foiled if we allow the only messaging to children to be stop, don't, it's bad, it's dirty, you're wrong, it's wicked. And so I think those stakes are high.
I agree. And I think that, I talk to a lot of people that will tell me something, maybe even more particularly women who will tell me, I never did masturbate. That wasn't anything I ever did. And I would just encourage people to really, we don't know. We don't really know, because our first 3 to 4 years of life, we really don't remember. And it's very, very typical to have, like a baby who, their hand kind of goes to their genitals when the diaper comes off, or you might have been touching yourself in the bathtub when you were 2. And it's very, very typical for a parent to say, stop it, or smack your hand away, or don't do that. And so you don't always know or remember the ways that you were kind of either forbidden or discouraged from self-exploration from a very early age. And I would be willing to bet that most of us had some type of experience like that, if you grew up in a home that, had these kinds of ideas. Another resource that's out there that's interesting is a parent's guide by the church on LDS.org. And nobody ever talks about it or refers to it, but it's there. And their first 12 years of child development, actually encourages parents to not worry about whether or not your child is touching yourself. So it's actually fairly sex positive information. Then, of course, when you get to the 12-year-olds, then their information shifts and they have really bad advice after that. But those first 12 years, like the primary age children, actually has some fairly okay guidelines in there as far as don't shame your child, don't draw attention to it, focus on privacy and things of that nature. So I think that's interesting that the church has that resource where it actually encourages parents not to shame small children.
So let's just say, let's skip to the part of puberty. And, there's this famous in U.S. culture, the birds and the bees, the talk about sexuality. We would all imagine that the most common Mormon parental approach to masturbation is to never talk about it, to never talk explicitly about it with their kid. And so all the kid does is they either learn what they learn at school or on the internet, or they hear these messages at church: masturbation's wrong, porn's wrong, don't self-stimulate. And that we imagine that that's and that many kids don't even learn what the word masturbation is until they're in a church setting, which in and of itself can be really bizarre, that they're getting sex ed at church, learning what even the word masturbation means. Right. So anyway, that's kind of one, probably the most common approach, which is it's never talked about, which in and of itself can be problematic or disastrous. And then a second approach is where a parent sits a kid down. Let's just say they're the more zealot parents, but more communicative, and they might sit that kid down and say, "Hey, you know, there's this thing called, you know, masturbation, or they might call it self-abuse, and it's not a good thing to do, so don't do it. And if you ever feel the desire, don't do it. And if you ever, you know, if you ever start having bad thoughts, sing a hymn and say a prayer. And if you ever actually do it, you need to tell us, you need to tell your bishop, and then you need to go through the repentance process because it's a sin." Let's say that those two approaches are not the optimal approaches for either a progressive Mormon or a post-Mormon. What is an effective, healthy approach? Because a lot of people come to me and say, "Well, I'm not just going to sit down with my kid and tell them to masturbate, to go crazy, that masturbation's awesome and they should do it whenever chance they get." And there are a lot of people that still preserve their very conservative mores and standards around sexuality, and they don't know how to talk to their kid about masturbation. How would you model, Natasha, Helfer Parker, sex therapist, how would you model talking to your kid about masturbation?
All right, so I'll give some ideas. Again, not comprehensive, and there's lots of ways of doing this because we all do have different personality styles. Some of us are more talkative. Some of us are more like, here's a book, here's, you know, chat. Sometimes your kids are different personalities, you know, and they need different approaches from you. But I do think starting early is important. So just, you know, some things that I noticed, I've raised both boys and girls. Boys are pretty much, you know, 2 or 3 telling you, "Oh, look at me, what's going on?" You know, and they're looking at their erect penis, right? And so you can say something like, "That's an erection," right? "Oh, that's good. That means your penis is working. That means blood is going into your penis. That happens sometimes to penises. Woohoo." You know, and you just have that kind of approach from a very early age. I remember one time going over a bump in the road and my daughter said something, I think she was 2 or 3, and she was like, "Oh, that tickled my vulva," you know, and I was like, "Oh, isn't that fun? Isn't it fun when our vulvas get tickled? That's a fun feeling," right? And so, yeah, that happens. We are able to talk about it. And then as they get older, you know, 10, 11, 12, I just am very education centric. So I do have books around that I make readily available for them. And I do have conversations. And sometimes I have one-on-one conversations, and sometimes I have family home evening conversations. And we've had family home evening conversations on masturbation, what the word means. I also give them permission to tell me other ways that their peers are talking about it. And when they look at me like, "I'm not going to say those words," I'm like, "Well, you know, like jacking off. Has anybody heard jacking off?" You know, and they're like, "Yes, we've heard that," right? And so we can talk about how other non-clinical ways these types of terms come up and what their friends might be saying about those things. And then we all giggle and we kind of laugh. And I'm sure some of my kids love it and some of my kids hate it, and they're all going to need to go to therapy anyway themselves. But I'm offering lots of information, right, around these issues. And so I say, well, you know, we all have genitals. For most people, touching your genitals feels good. Sometimes you touch them just kind of like, you know, you would sucking your thumb and you don't really do anything else. Sometimes you touch them long enough or in a way, in a rhythm, that it kind of leads you to what we call an orgasm, which is like a really nice feeling, like, wow, something really explosive has happened in my body. Sometimes for boys, that means that you get ejaculate, sperm comes out of your penis, right? So I'm very upfront about what's happening in the body. For girls, you might notice that you have some wetness in your vagina, and I don't necessarily split them up either. I want them to understand, as boys and girls, what's happening in boys and girls' bodies, right, in female and male bodies, so that they can understand what's happening not just in their own body, but in the opposite sex. So those are things that I've tried and been very frank about. And I've said, you know, you have the right to touch your body at any point. Your body is your own. Of course, that goes into also a lot of, like child abuse type of conversations, like who doesn't have the right to touch your body, what situations would you not want somebody to touch your body, and what can you do if you're in a situation like that. So we also go down that route. I talk about privacy, especially when you have a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old, or usually about the time of 7, they become more private. But before that, they might be rubbing up against the grocery cart, because their legs are in between this thing, and they might be, like rubbing up against that. And I'm like, I'm glad that feels good. And yet we're in public, so let's wait until we're in a private space to have our genitals feel good, right? So that's something that just in our culture, we just kind of decided that was private stuff to do.
So a couple questions are coming to mind for me with my kind of Orthodox hat on. The first is we've got the obstacle in Mormonism of never wanting to talk explicitly about anatomical parts or even the term sex. I would guess that most Mormons have never heard the word sex actually uttered in sacrament meeting or, at church. Instead, if we're even going to talk about the topic of sexuality other than don't look at porn, we're basically going to use the word intimacy in replace of the word sex. And of course, in a church setting, you're never going to hear the word penis or vulva or vagina or ejaculate, in church, because we are constitutionally uncomfortable talking about terms explicitly within Mormonism. So that's the first problem that my Orthodox brain has with your suggestion. How do we get over that? And then beyond that, I think there's when you're talking about like, oh, you have an erect penis, wonderful, let's celebrate, or oh, your vulva's tickled while you're driving in the car, that's wonderful. That's something you can enjoy when you're alone. Like, I think that there is a fear that, number one, if we use sexually explicit terms or sexually accurate terms or anatomically accurate terms, and if we talk about genitals and erections and stimulation and orgasms all in a very positive, explicit way, that's going to make kids more likely to have premarital sex, which means that they'll get STIs and unwanted teen pregnancy, and they'll commit sins next to murder. So I think there's just this fear that talking about it, talking explicitly about it, using anatomically correct terms, and even being positive about it is going to lead to the behavior we don't want. Can you help us maybe dispel that myth? Or is that just true that a side effect of being sex positive and talking about anatomically correct terms and celebrating sexuality means your kids are going to be having lots of sex as teens in high school?
Okay, so many things that you said there that I'm going to try to revisit. So first of all, the main thing I would say to parents, because yes, I agree, most of us were not offered what I'm saying we should be offering our kids, which means that we're going to be dealing with our own anxiety, our own misinformation. And so we really have to take our own sexual education very seriously and look for good resources. And I've got tons of resources on my webpage and on Sex Talk with Natasha that you can look at as far as books you can give your kids, books you can read yourself, TED Talks, podcast. Mormon Sex Info has tons of that. I did an entire parenting series on Sex Talk with Natasha. I mean, there's lots of resources, either mine or other people's, that you can hone in on and really start getting comfortable with this information and with the language yourself. Because a lot of how we present the tone to our children, if we're super nervous and anxious, then they're going to pick up on, oh, well, mom's talking about this or dad's talking about this, but it's obviously still not super cool to talk about this, right? And so we want our children to feel like we are fairly comfortable. When we're not, it's okay to just tell our kids that. It's okay to tell your kid, you know what, I'm not really good at talking about this either. Nobody talked to me about things the way I wish people had talked to me. So I'm trying to do a better job with you, but sometimes I get nervous, or I might giggle, or I might not know something, or I might, feel flustered, and you might see that, and that's okay. So talking about process with kids can be really important, especially teenage kids who pick up on your process very, very easily. So yes, educate yourself, get comfortable with this type of information. Even me, with all the training I have faced my own discomfort on a regular basis with my kids, and that's okay. We can be patient with ourselves. As far as the other, the other thing I was going to say, I don't think that, I'm not a proponent that church has to be the place where we're talking about sex and ejaculates and erections and penises and vulvas. I don't know that it's our church's role to necessarily be a sexual educator. I think the church can have some parameters around sexual values and sexual principles and how we relate as a people and as a community in sexual ways that are fairly basic and fall under kind of like golden rule type ideas around any type of life, right? Like be kind and be nice and, treat people nicely and be a good sexual partner. I think that there's some room for church to do that, but I don't think, especially Mormon church, shouldn't be the place that we're wanting sexual education to come from. The only church I know of that does a good job with that is the Unitarian Church with their OWL program, Our Whole Lives. And they've done a very good integrative approach with sexual values and comprehensive, positive sexual education. And they've married those two. But that comes with a lot of flexibility in how people are going to show up sexually, which we don't necessarily have in our Mormon kind of standards. So I don't want church to be a place where they're hearing all those things. That's the place where at home we need to be offering that. And the public schools offer that at some level, and they do, I would say, a C+ job for the most part and the only reason they do a C+ job is because we as taxpayers have limited the amount of information that we are comfortable giving our children. So we do not have comprehensive sexual education in this country because we as taxpayers vote against it every single time. So there's only so much that the school system can do. They are really focused on reproductive sexual education and risk-oriented sexual education, and that's it. And abstinence-only education in many, many areas, and not LGBTQ plus affirming. So even the school is very, very limited. So it really does fall on us as parents to be the primary sexual educators of our children and to do so in non-abusive, non-shaming ways. When we know better, we do better. And I hope that that's what we're offering here, is that when we know better, we do better. And we can always, I don't care how old your kid is, if you've got kids who are adults, you can go back and tell them, you know what, I know better now. I know that what I did or what I said wasn't helpful to you. And I'd like for you to at least have the acknowledgement that maybe some of the things that I said while I was raising you played a negative impact in your life. That can be a life-changing moment for a person to have a parent go back, even in their adulthood, and have a conversation that's much more sex positive, because they're still having sex, right? They're still having to deal with those messages that maybe you were a part of sharing. Now, as far as your last point, the research is just super clear on it. I don't really have to spend too much time on it. The research shows that the more information our kids have, the more language they have, the more sex positive information they have, the more options they have, the better they do. They wait for the riskier types of sexual activity. So they wait longer to have penis vaginal intercourse, penis anal intercourse. They wait longer for even oral sex. That doesn't mean that they necessarily will wait to be sexual in some way or another. But all of the European countries that have comprehensive sexual education have us beat on every single statistic, from waiting for intercourse to unwanted pregnancies to all kinds of things. So that fear that somehow if I give my kid information, they're going to take that information and use it in ways that I don't want is really unfounded. And we actually take much higher risks when we leave our kids uneducated. The reality is that unwanted pregnancies happen most with people who've been educated in abstinence-only approaches because they don't know how to protect themselves, from an unwanted pregnancy. So, in some cases, just like anything in life, I think about a cooking show, for example. If you see something or hear something that you weren't aware of before, you might try it out or think about it. So maybe if you talk to your 11-year-old about masturbation, maybe they haven't thought about it quite yet, and maybe now they will. and instead of maybe waiting till they were 13. But I would much rather your kid have that risk than the majority of the other risks that happen when you don't talk to your kids. So you really have to do a risk cost analysis and risk benefit analysis. And the benefits way outweigh the risks when we're talking to our kids in sex positive, educational, comprehensive educational ways.
Yeah. And if we just look at, maybe some of these myths, are Mormon kids masturbating? Absolutely.
Yes, they are.
It's an epidemic everywhere. So
I know
clearly what we're doing,
it's an epidemic, like pooping. Pooping is an epidemic.
Yeah, there's a drinking water epidemic, there's a sleeping epidemic, and there's a masturbation epidemic, right? So I mean, it's not logical to think that if we change our approach, kids will start masturbating, because they already are in droves. You talk to any bishop, I think they would say it's the biggest problem in the ward is masturbation. Like, ask any BYU bishop or bishopric member, it's the biggest problem, and they're so tired of dealing with it because it's ridiculous. So they're masturbating anyway. You've already shown that you've already told us from the scientific evidence that what's effective. They're less likely to get pregnant. They're less likely to have penis vaginal intercourse. They're less likely to get STIs. Like, what indicator do you need to realize that talking openly and healthily and positively about sexuality is good for your kids? It's just effective. But on the counter side, I'll never ever forget, I'm working at MIT. I'm working with these professors from all over the world. And I have this professor from the De Anza Foothill College in California system say to me, "Oh, John, are you Mormon?" "Oh, okay. I had the weirdest thing happen. I've got these female students that work with me or that are my students, and they kind of treat me as their second mom. And they disclosed to me confidentially that they and their boyfriends who were set to go on missions were having anal sex, because anal sex isn't intercourse, so it doesn't violate the law of chastity, and they don't get pregnant, and so it's not that bad. And I know that we're not here to shame anal sex, and that some people find ways to incorporate that in a healthy way. But are there health risks, Natasha, to not talking about these issues and having youth sort of take whatever folk wisdom is on the street and incorporate into that sort of do's and don'ts about how they're going to navigate their sexuality?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's very different to have anal sex because you're curious and wanting to experience something fun and new and may find it really pleasurable as you explore that, versus, oh, this is an avenue, this is a loophole to some other type of sex that I would actually much rather have and much rather would enjoy or much rather would explore first. And of course, a lot of kids aren't necessarily that savvy about how to have anal sex without, tearing or unnecessary pain or all those kinds of things, using lubrication, who's teaching them those things? And so I think that they do have much higher risks. Plus, one thing that we didn't talk about either is when you give your children correct anatomical language, that puts them at much less risk of not knowing what's happened to them if there was some type of trauma or assault or abuse. It's like I've talked to many children's prosecutors or interviewers, when they're trying to figure out what's happened. And when a child says, well, they touched me down there, or they touched my hoo-hee or my wee-wee, the investigators don't really know what that means. Is that my scrotum, my testicles, my shaft, my vulva, my inside the vagina, my hips,
stomach,
my butt, my anus. So it is really, really important that kids know all the different parts of their body so that when and if anything happens, they're very equipped to say, yeah, that was that area of the body that was touched or penetrated or whatever happened. So it's just so education in every aspect of life benefits people, whether it's sexual or any other area of life. And
don't not talk about, don't not be sex positive, and don't not talk openly with your kids about sexuality because you think that's going to help prevent masturbation and sexual exploration.
Yeah.
My kids went to high school in Utah. Sex and sexuality is everywhere. Masturbation is everywhere. What we're doing isn't working. And what we're trying to tell you is a more effective approach, even for the outcomes you want, which is a decreased chance or likelihood of premarital intercourse, or a decreased likelihood of rape, or a decreased likelihood of getting an STI or a teen pregnancy, whatever metric you care about. Being sex positive and talking openly in an educated way, accurately about masturbation and body parts is going to help you achieve your ultimate goal, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Tamara Dexter says, every kid is different. I was very open about sexuality with my kids. I have a child that became a teen parent. I worried that I had encouraged sex, but then I realized that this particular child would have made the choices she did no matter what I taught. I did my part to get her birth control young because I realized she was a risk taker and an adventure seeker. My other daughter said she wanted to wait because she wanted to be a teenager longer. She saw her sister's experience and didn't want that for herself. I think since we're talking to a group of faith transitioners, this is one of the things that can happen is there's no guarantee that, of course, sexual education is going to keep your child from taking risks or from having experiences that they regret, or that
they love,
or that they love, or any of those things. And I think sometimes when we're going through a faith transition, we get into that panic mode, like, oh my gosh, what have I done? I thought I was choosing the right thing, and maybe I would have avoided all of this by staying more, orthodox and, taking the approach that the Mormon Church told me to take. That's a very normal response. And what I want to say is just, repeat what John said. Plenty of people that are very Mormon and grow up in very Orthodox Mormon homes become teen parents. Many people have sexual experiences. Many people masturbate. Many people do all those kinds of things regardless of their upbringing. So all we can control is what we are offering as parents. And in that space, the research is behind education every single time.
Kristen Gluth Cranny, one of our special listeners, our expert listeners, our fans, she writes, there is a zero tolerance view on masturbation and pornography in the church. If it is happening, happiness cannot be attained, personally or in a marriage, not only because of the evil and dangerous nature of the behavior, but also the teaching that you are not worthy of blessings or the Holy Ghost. Thank you, Kristen. That is a really
and that's part of the problem. I mean, going back to what we were talking about, the problem is that when it comes to sexuality, more so than any other sin, again, if you want to consider it sin, we have a zero-sum tolerance for it, right? So if your goal is to try to yell less at your kids, you're usually not going to go into the bishop and confess every single time you yelled at your kids. You're going to maybe go see a therapist. You're going to go take a parenting class. You're still going to yell at your kids, but if you decrease that behavior by, let's say, 50%, you still feel pretty good about yourself and you're doing well and you're feeling more, in line with your values. We don't really offer that in the sexuality realm. It's either you're not doing it at all, and that's the only way that you can be quote unquote righteous, or you're doing it. It doesn't matter what spectrum, you're now in this sin, awful, not worthy type of reality. And that is a very unhealthy approach to any type of human behavior that we're trying to progress in or have, a shift in.
I love it. Lots of other cool comments. Marcy writes, I'm so grateful that I still have 3 kids at home. Did you already read that one? That
no.
Haven't been shamed or guilted for doing something that is so healthy and natural. In fact, being able to discuss openly with our 20-year-old son about how our views on masturbation have evolved prevented him from going on a mission a couple years ago, which would have been devastating to us and him. He would have gone for all the wrong reasons and failed his mission president interviews miserably. Thank you, Marcy. We're so happy for you. Penny writes, I agree that our kids should not be shamed for masturbation and for looking at pornography. I believe in having a conversation about healthy sexuality. And of course, Aaron, another one of our super fans and friends, writes, this is a really important topic. Thanks, guys. So, Natasha, if it's important to have healthy conversations, I just want to hear it. You're sitting your 14-year-old son or your 16-year-old daughter or your 12-year-old son or daughter down. Talk us through how you have the talk about masturbation. Is it
well, and it's much of what I've just said. And as they get older, I say, you know what, the fact that you can masturbate is a wonderful way to self-regulate. You don't ever have to do anything with a boyfriend or girlfriend or any friend that you're not comfortable doing. If you want to pause or come home and take care of yourself, that's awesome.
Or even before you go on a date, take care of yourself.
Or even before you go on a date, so that you're not all angsty, worrying about it. And another thing, because I do have, one particular child who still goes to church, and, is very interested in his relationship with that. And so my main area of being very upfront with him has been in this area. So I'm like, well, my positions on things, that the church teaches very differently about pornography, masturbation, and I also tell them a lot about privacy. It's none of my business if you're masturbating. You don't have to tell me. You don't have to tell me if you're looking at sexually explicit things. Here's what I can tell you about sexually explicit things. I mean, that's where we're moving next, is into that category. But it's not my business. And it's, especially masturbation, is never my business. If you want to tell me about that, if you have a question about it, if you're worried about anything, I'm here. But it's not something that you need to tell me about. And it's not something that the bishop should be asking you about. Now, I have had very specific conversations with my bishop about what he's allowed to ask my kids. I have told him I would prefer for him to leave the law of chastity question out altogether. He told me he's not comfortable doing that, but that he is comfortable just asking that question without any further, probing questions, which I know in our stake in particular, they have been asked to ask the probing questions about pornography and masturbation. So I know that in our stake, that currently is what's being asked of the bishops to ask for. So I've told him you're not allowed to do that with my son. And so we've said the law of chastity. And I said, okay, and I will teach the law of chastity to my son how I see fit. So we talk about sexual principles in my home, the 6 principles of sexual health, which I think many people have heard me talk about. I have, and I've told, my son, basically, this is the only question that they get to ask you, and you get to interpret that to mean what you want it to mean. And this is how I would like for you to have that mean, that you are, feeling healthy, that you feel like your sexuality is in balance with the rest of your life, that if you are masturbating or looking at things, that those are things that you do in balance with the rest of your life, that you're respectful of anybody you would date, that you would never do anything non-consensual, that you would never participate in something you're not comfortable participating in because you feel pressured, because it's not just girls that feel pressured to do sexual things. And I just have those conversations very openly. He's going to EFY here in a week, and I say, you know what, I'm probably going to agree with most of the things they say there, except for anything they talk about with sex. So just keep that critical thinking lens on. Now, I know that he can choose not to believe me, and he can choose to believe the church. That's true of pretty much any entity that's out there for my children. The best I can do is prepare my children with information that I have, and so far that's worked for us.
Yeah, and I'll just add, when I've had this conversation with my children, and I have had this conversation with all our children, it goes something like this. It goes something like, as biological creatures, we are, we've evolved to have sex, to procreate, to create offspring, and biologically, it's advantageous for that to feel good, because that's nature, that's evolution motivating us to replicate and procreate, because that's how our species stays alive. And so once you reach puberty, you have built within you this sort of like urge to be sexual, but it's also not healthy and optimal for you to be having babies when you're 13 or 14 or 15, because you got to get an education, you got to get financially set, you got to get your feet on the ground, you got to get a stable life, get emotionally and physically mature. And so you're going to have this conflicting feelings of these regular sexual urges coming out, urging you to procreate. And, we have standards, or we have values that sort of say you want to be really thoughtful and careful about sexuality in those early years. And so that combination is naturally going to make you want to self-stimulate or masturbate because, number one, your body sort of calls for a sexual release, and it feels really good. And so I just want to tell you that you're going to get a lot of messages about masturbation, and a lot of them are going to be negative. And I just want to tell you that it is completely normal. It is nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing. It's not dirty. It's not bad. It's actually normal. The statistics show that probably over 90%, of men. And what's the percentage of women, Natasha?
I think the research shows I think it's 95% of men and about 89, almost 90% of women say that they've masturbated at some point or another. But that's probably 5 years old too. And I think that the more we see the stigmas of things going away, the more people are willing to say that they've done things. Even in anonymous surveys, people will lie about sexual things pretty often just because they have internalized shame.
But the point is, pretty much everyone has either done it or is doing it, including the bishop or the Relief Society president that's telling you not to,
yep.
Including the mission president and all the missionaries that you see. I mean, it is a common battle for missionaries to have to try and cope with their feelings on that 2-year mission or 1.5-year mission. But the point is, it's healthy, it's normal. There are things to look out for. If you're having a lot of anxiety or depression or boredom or whatever, it's one thing to sort of have it be a natural release or a source of joy. It's another thing to be using it as a form of self-medicating when you should find a way to cope with your anxiety and depression in other ways that or at least directly address the anxiety and the depression and not avoid getting treatment or support and have it be a mask or something that that kind of covers up other healing that you need to do. And of course, you should be thoughtful about where and how you do it. You don't want to be an exhibitionist. You don't want to do it where people can catch you or see you. You want to be discreet or thoughtful about it. And there probably comes a point where it can become excessive. And I don't know medically what that would be. But the point I want to tell you, child, is you never need to feel shame or guilt about it. It's normal. If you do it, that's great. If you don't do it, that's great. Everybody's going to be doing it differently. And like you said, Natasha, ultimately it's your private business. No one needs to have any input or feedback into what you do, as long as you're kind of smart and thoughtful about it. And that's just kind of the general message. Anything you'd want to add to that before we go on to the pornography discussion?
No, I would agree. I do. I'm glad you clarified it. I do tell them that it's a wonderful way to deal with stress and anxiety and depression. It's one way to deal. It shouldn't be your only way to deal, right? And to your point, it shouldn't be the only way you treat those things if they're serious things, right? So if you're depressed or anxious, then there's other things we should be doing to address that topic, like therapy or medication or exercise or, other things. But one of the things that's very difficult for me to see on sex addiction questionnaires is, do you use sex or anything sexual to cope with the stressors of life? And if you say yes to that, that puts you in that category of you're probably, one more category of you're a sex addict. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's actually a very healthy way to deal with the stressors and difficulties of life is this wonderful system we have within ourselves to have a sexual release. It releases wonderful hormonal shifts in dopamine and all this estrogen and everything that kind of just flows through your body and makes you feel good. So
oxytocin, don't forget oxytocin.
Right. We want sex and masturbation to be part of your coping mechanism in life. We just want you to have a diversity of things that you can count on, that it's not. And as far as how many times you masturbate a day, there's really not,
or a week or a month.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the only thing that we want to maybe say is, don't to the point that maybe you're harming yourself, like the one kind of extreme case that you gave where there's genital sores and things like that, then yeah, that's become something that's out of balance in your life. What's that about? And remember, that's not usually a masturbation problem. That's a depression problem or an anxiety problem. Or so to try to say, oh, let's take masturbation away because that's going to be the way that we deal with this problem, which is what the church does, just take masturbation away, does nothing to address whatever underlying problem is causing that symptom. So that's what we want to figure out.
I love it. Okay. So now let's talk about how to talk to a child about pornography. Is there any level setting you want to do about there is a lot of probably overwhelming amount of negativity, especially in the Orthodox and progressive Mormon space around, and just in general Judeo-Christian world around pornography being evil, perverted, bad, unhealthy, disrespectful to women, setting unrealistic expectations around performance and sex and sexuality. There's child porn, which is atrocious. There's different types of porn which seem to be unhealthy or really disproportionate. And then there's a whole problem of the health, the physical, mental, and psychological, spiritual health of the sex workers. There's a lot of abuse and I've heard disease sometimes in some of these in the porn industry. There's a lot of exploitation, and there's the issue of sex trafficking and that sort of thing. And then there's just the feelings that it's betrayal. There are all sorts of feelings and even data around how the pornography industry and pornography viewing is problematic. So how can you straighten that out for us, Natasha? Is that all legitimate? Is some of it legitimate and some of it not? How do we look at pornography?
Oh, man. You just brought up like a 5-hour discussion with all of that. So one thing I'm going to excuse from this, from today's topic altogether is anything criminal. So child pornography, anything that's done by force, anything like that, I'm just going to excuse because those are criminal behaviors. And
condemn, you mean, not excuse?
Excuse from our conversation
today. Oh, okay. Got it. Okay.
Right. Like just not, I'm not going to be talking about it from a criminal perspective. So okay, the type of sexually explicit materials I will talk about today are where there are sex workers who are paid to do what they want to do, or really the rising type of sexual explicit materials out there is just voyeuristic, exhibitionistic types of people who just in the amateur world enjoy filming themselves and putting it online. So that's actually the number one growing type of sexual explicit material out there is just couples and people who enjoy doing that. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. And I want to start off, before we even start talking about how we talk about it to kids, I just like to talk about it in general. So sexually explicit materials have been around forever. You can find wonderful cave drawings of penises ejaculating and people having sex and all kinds of fun, weird positions and kink and all kinds of things on cave drawings. Okay, so that's been around forever. We've always been curious about each other's sexualities. We've always been influenced by each other's sexualities, and depending on the culture and religion and time that you grew up in, some of those things, there's some cultures that really didn't make a very big deal about even public forms of sexual activity versus, our system today, which is very much in closed bedrooms, and we don't really show anything that's happening sexual. So I just want to normalize that. Also, the research shows that all of us are aroused by sexually explicit materials. Now, remember, arousal is different than desire. So arousal means that you'll probably get an erection, or you'll lubricate, or your pupils will dilate, or your nipples will become hard, or your heartbeat will increase. That's signs of arousal. Even if you're having a disgust emotion around what you're watching, you will probably still have an arousal response. Desire is more like, am I enjoying it? Am I liking it? Do I want to have this type of material in front of me? Do I enjoy this aspect of my arousal? So just remember that those are two different things. So what is different today than any other time is that sexually explicit materials are now more available than ever before. On our smartphones, on our computers. Just in the touch of your hand, you have access to sexually explicit materials. Most people use sexually explicit materials to masturbate. So most people use sexually explicit materials as a form or something to help them masturbate. So instead of having to come up with something in their own creative mind, here's, something that is turning me on. And that's why most people use sexually explicit materials for the, 2 minutes to 20 minutes it takes to have an orgasmic response, an ejaculatory response, or something of that nature. And that's how most people use it.
And most people just they feel this pent up release, this pent up pressure, this sort of biological need to have an orgasm, and porn becomes the way that they achieve the orgasm, whether it's a 2-minute or 20-minute thing. That's overwhelmingly
overwhelmingly how it's used. Yeah. Probably the second primary way it's used, and this is probably where it's most problematic, is our teenagers use it for sexual education. When they're curious about something, they'll Google it, and voila. So that's a problem. But in the grand scheme of things, what's interesting about the research that is done under the parameters that I would consider research, because there's a lot of data out there. You have to be careful who's doing the research, who's behind the research, and then who's interpreting the research. So I've talked to a lot of neuroscientists that are saying, this research that I did is being used now by religious right entities in ways that are incorrect ways to correlate our findings. So that happens. So you have to be very careful about what you think is good research on porn. And
so is Fight the New Drug or Porn Kills Love, when they show the brain scans and they compare it to drug addiction, the viewing of pornography, is that scientifically credible, useful, helpful?
No,
Why not?
It is not.
Why not?
Well, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I will just say Mormon Sex Info podcast with Nicole Prousey is the podcast you want to listen to. She does an excellent job, and she's a prominent researcher in our country today that just has debunked and has all the terms that I would not know how to very clearly talk about it. But what I will say is that sexuality is different from other behaviors, and mainly what I understood is satiety, however you say that word.
Right.
So when people gamble, for example, which is a behavioral kind of out of control, it can become a behavioral out of control kind of thing. They can win, all the coins come out, and they're right back at the next thing. There's no satiety that kicks in. And so that's why in the DSM-5, you find gambling as a disorder. Okay. Sexuality, pretty much once you have an orgasm, it forces you into that stage of now, you kind of stop masturbating, you stop looking at porn. So it doesn't have the same drive that other types of behaviors do. video gaming right now seems to be something that could potentially become, it's right now in the back of the DSM-5, which means it's still needing to have a lot of research around it. But it's one of those things, again, where it potentially has that disturbance of satiety. Like you don't ever get satiated. And so it becomes like hours and hours and hours that you could spend on things like that without your brain saying, hey, we've had enough, let's go do something else. So that's probably the number one thing that I can share as far as from a neuroscience perspective that disqualifies anything to do with sex as kind of this. And again, I don't ever want to use the term addiction because that's not even really a clinical term. It's more about a dependence type of format. And it's very, very different than substances. So if they can say, well, sex, they can show that dopamine goes through the brain, and releases. Well, that's true, but that's also true of the brain that's looking at puppy pictures on, your Instagram post, or it's true of the time when you eat chocolate, that's a normal response. We don't want to pathologize normal responses. And the other thing that all of these studies have a problem with is that when there is a brain issue, there wasn't a brain study before the brain had an issue. So they're automatically correlating sexually explicit materials with the brain issue, when maybe what we're really finding is that some people have certain disorders or certain sexual drive. Like if you're a higher drive person, which there are people who have higher sexual drives than others, your behavior is going to look different than a lower drive person. But now all of a sudden we're blaming porn for that instead of the fact that you have a higher drive to begin with. So there's no way to really, take two equal brains and see, oh yeah, this is going to really, affect you. The fact that you've been doing this for 2 months and you haven't, now your brain looks different than this person. So the biggest kind of critique of these studies that the brains could have been different to begin with. And then all of these people who are parts of these studies are they're self-identifying as addicts. They're coming in, they're studying these people who are self-identifying in these ways that they're saying that they have a problem. So lots and lots of problems with the data that's been collected on this kind of stuff. Yeah,
one of the fundamental rules of science is don't conflate correlation with causation. Just because two things happen at an increased frequency together doesn't mean one causes the other or that they cause each other. And that's, the classic example is the rooster crows and the sun rises. That doesn't mean that the rooster's crowing causes the sun to rise. It's just that they both happen to happen at the same time. Yeah. And so some of these fight the new drug and porn kills love movements, they really do advance bad science. So an example would be they show the brain scans of the brain lighting up when it's on cocaine or heroin, and then they show the brain scans when someone's looking at porn, and similar regions are lighting up. Therefore, porn is like drugs. But the problem is those are pleasure centers in the brain lining up. And if drugs cause pleasure and, ejaculation causes pleasure, then, of course, the same areas of the brain are going to be lighting up. But that doesn't mean that porn is the same thing in terms of being an addictive thing as drugs. It's just a total false equivalence, and it's bad science to make that suggestion.
And those same areas would light up if you're having vanilla sex and a great orgasm with your husband. But
right, yeah.
You're addicted to your husband, right?
Or eating, or, other forms of pleasure, like you said, looking at kittens. But another thing is they'll say things like, well, Jeffrey Dahmer, the mass murderer, started out looking at porn, or Ted Bundy started out by looking at porn, or some serial killer said in their dying testimony before they were on death row, it all started with looking at porn. You know what I mean? Right. But they all drank water. They all slept. They all lived. They all were humans. Like, you can't ever just sort of say it all began with porn, because there's billions of people on the earth that masturbated and looked at porn who didn't become serial killers and who are just fine.
And in fact, the reality is, which is kind of an ethical dilemma for many of us, is that the more porn there is to watch, the less criminal activity we see. So those people who are maybe slated towards having, psychopathic or sociopathic or criminal types of predispositions, when they have an outlet, they're less likely to offend. So that's actually been the case, and all the research has shown that very, very adequately. And again, since we're in this kind of experiment of having sexual explicit materials at our fingertips more than ever before, we are not seeing an increase in anything criminally. We're not seeing an increase in erectile dysfunction, which you hear a lot of myths about that. We're not seeing an increase in rapes or assaults. We're not seeing an increase in violence in sexuality.
Or teenage pregnancy or STIs, right?
So if this would be kind of, if the stories we were telling about pornography and sexually explicit materials were true, the last 20 years should have us like overwhelmed in our clinics and our practices. As a sex therapist, I don't see anything. I see actually less people with erectile dysfunction because I think more people are educating themselves about, I don't have to feel bad if my, penis goes limp every now and then. So they're not like as anxious about it. So education and resources actually help. Now, that's not to dismiss that there aren't issues. I don't want to just say there's never issues, but I would say that the majority of the people who've come into my clinic around sexually explicit materials fall into, and I would say like 85 to 90% of the people who come in are typically men, are typically the higher libido partner, so sometimes women who are the higher libido partner, and are being shamed on the spectrum where it's really tragic. Like they may look at something once a month or once every 6 months, or maybe they haven't looked at something for 3 years and all of a sudden they looked at something again, and they're coming in high levels of distress themselves and with their partners, again, with these betrayal narratives. Very, very much their marriage is in danger of ending. And they're considering themselves addicts, and their spouses are considering themselves addicts. Okay, so that would be like a majority of the people that I've seen coming from a Mormon clientele, and even here in Wichita with an evangelical clientele. That's how people present. I would
for
say,
me, it was often 3 weeks. It was like every 3 weeks. I try not to do it. I try not to do it. I'm an addict because about once every 3 weeks I masturbate and maybe look at a little bit of porn, and then they double down again to try and stop. And it's just so weird to hear someone who's masturbating basically once a month calling themselves an addict, right? Which
isn't even accurate as far as, when you think about substance dependence, which is what most people think about when they think about addiction. That's typically like a daily issue, that people have gotten to a point where they daily are dependent. Their body has become dependent on a chemical. And if they don't have that chemical, they go into a withdrawal type of effect that can actually make them very sick. And so just to conflate those two things and to have the language now be about your sexuality, like you're diseased and you're always going to have this disease, and you're going to have to be sober. And I mean, people talk about their sexuality and their partner's sexuality in this type of, 12-step program type of language, which is just a horrific way to approach your human sexuality, which is part of who you are. And really the reality for like 85 to 90% of that clientele that come in is that they have poor sexual education. They've grown up with negative scripts. They don't know how to contract maritally. They don't know realistic expectations about sexuality. They don't know how to really show up in their sexual selves. Those are the real problems that are happening, and we're blaming it all on porn. And on top of it, we're making one person usually in that program sick, and we're making the other person the enabler, which becomes this horrific way of having a marriage around your sexual health. So now for the 10 to 15% of the people that I would say have become out of balance with their sexuality in some way, where it is becoming a daily issue, where they've spent, monies that they didn't have to spend on it, when things have become what we would consider maybe more out of control, secrecy, lots of lying to their partner, lots of infidelity, which I tend to count, a person as infidelity, not just something you're looking at. Then yes, you have other things that might be going on, but again, it's not addiction. It's something, that symptom is a symptom of something else. And so lots of things in the addiction model go untreated, like personality disorders. When I get a wife who comes to me and says, I can't believe what you said in your presentation. You don't understand my reality. You don't understand what I've been through. You don't understand, and I'm like,
and it's often like my husband sleeps with prostitutes.
Yeah, my husband's sleeping with prostitutes.
He's a serial adulterer.
I've been putting up with his, disgusting behavior for like 20 years. I'm like, that's not porn addiction. That's not sex addiction. That you're probably married to a personality disordered person, or there's some type of mental health diagnosis there that has gone untreated and that has, completely like taken over both of your lives. And yes, absolutely, you have a right to be upset about that. You absolutely have a right to not want to be married to that. And you have a right to place boundaries and get divorced or whatever you need to do to take care of yourself in a situation like that.
And by the way, a lot of these people are active in church, and it'd be just as erroneous to blame the church for their prostitution habit or serial adultery habit. It would be just as erroneous to blame the church as it would be porn, because you're making you're making something causal that's just a correlation.
Right.
And porn may be an outgrowth of their own personality or biological disposition, not the cause. So you can't, again, directionality is important. It's very easy to say porn causes all these problems. If I stop the porn, I'll cause all these problems. But maybe his prostitution, serial infidelity, and porn use or porn excessive use is a function to untreated disorders, but somehow we sometimes over-associate and over-blame the porn when you may as well blame sleeping or drinking water or attending church as the reason he's seeing prostitutes, or sex workers, whatever the.
And if you don't get a correct assessment, and if you don't really understand what's going on, you're not going to be able to ever shift those things. So I put porn issues that come into my office into 3 categories. One is that it's really coming in from a narrative and a values perspective that's too rigid and is unrealistic around human sexuality. I put most of the people that come into my practice in that regard. You can still be upset about it. It can still not fit your values. You can still want to decrease the amount of that or have to negotiate in your marriage. That's all fine, but it falls under that category. Second is that there's some underlying diagnosis that hasn't been treated, or a personality disorder, and those things are not being treated. And the third thing that pisses me off even the most is that there's a legal criminal part of this behavior. This doesn't come into my office as much, but I hear about it in the news all the time and in all the conferences that I go to. And what's happening is that the sex addiction model is being used to lessen the accountability. So, he molested 5 people, but he's a sex addict, so he's sick. So now we're going to, put him in jail for less amount of time because, this is a disease, and it's not that at all. And sex offender treatment is a whole different perspective and whole different world. And yet this addiction model is being used kind of as an excuse for people's criminal behavior. So for me, the sex addiction model fails on every single level. It's just so atrocious and so not backed by science. And so, but the Mormon Mental Health Association was we were like ahead of some other organizations in making a position statement against sex addiction treatment and protocols and modalities, because Mormon people are, again, vulnerable to that kind of shenanigan. It's a shenanigan, and we're vulnerable to it. Even good therapists are vulnerable to it because it fits under their paradigm. So they go and get this training, and they think that they're doing the right thing, and it's not backed by effectivity treatment. It's not best standard of care treatment.
How do you talk to your kid about porn? So let's just say you catch your kid, they're 13, they're 14, they're in the shower, they're in their bedroom, they've got their mobile phone, they've got their iPad, they're on the computer, or you're browsing the history. You find out either preventatively you want to talk to your kid about porn, or even more likely you catch your kid looking at porn. Give us a framework for a healthy conversation with your kid about porn, because I'm hearing my Orthodox listeners go, what, are you just going to tell your kid to go crazy, look at porn all the time? Like, how do you have a conversation with your kid about porn?
Right. Well, so a few things that I'll just give out as resources. Marty Klein, who's a nationally known sexologist, did a porn literacy checklist. I've also done a webinar on how to talk to kids about porn. So whatever I say in 10 minutes, you can probably do better as far as the types of stuff that's out there. But the main thing that we want to tell kids, first of all, is to normalize it. It's normal to be curious. It's normal to be aroused. It's normal to find those things erotic, and it's normal to find them easy to masturbate to. The second thing is we want to watch our tone so that we're not becoming, anxious and screechy and weird and start taking away smartphones and monitoring everything, because it's not going to help.
Putting on filters and all that stuff,
yeah,
right?
Our kids are so savvy. They're always going to beat us on those kinds of things.
Or sending them to addiction recovery program.
Oh, please don't do that, because then you start the disease model with your child, and that's abusive. In my point of view, that's an abusive thing to do to your child, is to make them feel diseased about their sexuality, which is normal. The main thing that you want to tell your kids is that pornography is adult entertainment. It is adult entertainment. And I usually give the Fast and Furious analogy. So you go to Fast and Furious and you see them drive these cars, and
the movie.
Yes, from personal experience, you know that our cars in our driveway don't look like the cars on Fast and Furious. Right? You know that mom and dad drive in ways that are very different from how they drive on Fast and Furious. You know that because you've been sitting in a car seat since you were a baby, and you've been able to see us drive, and you see the cars, and you see how we take care of them, and you have lots of experiential experience. So you go to Fast and Furious, and you can have a good time, and you can be entertained, but you don't see people coming out of Fast and Furious and start driving like maniacs out of the parking lot, right? And start driving out of buildings and jumping pools and whatever they're doing on that show. It's entertainment. It's pretend. It's actors and actresses, doing a show. The problem with pornography is that you haven't been in my bedroom with dad. You probably, other than a few moments of embarrassment, you probably haven't seen me naked very much. You haven't, had a lot of hands-on experience with sexuality, because it's this private thing in our culture, and we keep that to ourselves, and that's appropriate boundaries. So if you're going to look at pornography, you're going to be seeing a movie, just like Fast and Furious. It's not realistic. That has a lot of things that are going on. What you might see in a 2-minute clip may have taken 3 hours to make that 2-minute clip. They may have injected a penis with a certain type of drug to keep it more erect for longer. They may have, they have lighting and certain positions. Actors are usually not quote unquote normal people. They don't look like the rest of us. They're in different types of shape. She may be able to do things with her leg and be flexible in ways that your girlfriend or your friend would not be able to put themselves in those kinds of positions. Dad and I don't get into those positions, so you may be seeing kind of unrealistic ways of even having a sexual encounter. There's not a lot of talking in pornography. There's not a lot of negotiating. There's not a lot of things that happen normally, like queefs and smiles, or having to stop to go to the bathroom, or putting on a condom, or, all these things that happen in regular sexual, negotiated spaces. You may not see pubic hair. Your girlfriend or boyfriend may have pubic hair. You may not, you may see a certain type of vulva that, just like in movies, we see size 2 bodies more than we see size 24 bodies, right? Well, you may not have that same experience. You may see circumcised penises versus an uncircumcised penis. So I tell them a lot of these things, and this is kind of, again, going through that porn literacy checklist of making sure our kids understand that pornography is entertainment. It's a movie. It's not real. You're not going to learn how to have good sex or be a good lover. If you have expectations that sex is going to be that way, you can potentially put a lot of pressure on yourself that's not healthy, and you can put a lot of pressure on a partner that's not healthy. So please put it into context. And the other thing that I tell...
So far you said normalize it, watch your tone, don't shame it. I even like the idea of just saying, hey, okay, you're now doing what most kids do, like welcome to learning about sexuality because that's what teens do. No shame, no guilt. I'm glad we're talking about it. So watch your tone, normalize it. And then you're talking about manage expectations so that you educate them and you set their expectations that porn isn't the real world. I love that. Okay, keep going.
And then, I was going to say something else. Darn it.
Oh, I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. No, that's okay. And what about talking about thing is the values?
Okay.
The values piece, because, there's a lot of this idea about objectifying and women are objectified. And I'll just say this. I mean, a lot of times our narratives around what's objectifying.
Oftentimes we use the word degrading, right? It's degrading to women.
Right. And the reality is that a lot of that comes from our patriarchal culture. So we have this idea that non-degrading sex is a woman being embraced and loved and gazed upon and having sweet, loving, making love. But what if a woman wants to, have anal sex from behind and wants her husband to grab her hair and wants to, have him say to her, I want you to fuck me. And what if she likes that? What if that's totally in her erotic template? Is that degrading her? Right? So it's interesting how we have these ideas around what's degrading, what's not degrading, what's righteous, what's not righteous, what's holy, what's unholy. Back to our oral sex idea, right? Like oral sex for many people was considered degrading. It's degrading to expect that you're going to put his penis in your mouth. Well, what if you like to have his penis in your mouth? Or what if you like to have her vulva in your mouth? What's degrading about that? So this is where I think we have to be very careful about our own biases, our own erotic templates, our own tastes and preferences, because kink and dom sub types of themes and rough play and rough words can very much be part of the erotic playground of our sexual lives.
You often say, don't yum my yuck and don't yuck my yum.
Right.
Right? I heard that from you.
Yes. And you'll see much more violent themes, I think, in music videos than you will in most mainstream pornography. Just because you don't like what's happening in a pornographic scene doesn't mean that it's in of itself degrading to the people who are involved in that scene and who maybe enjoy that type of sexual play. But as we talk about this, Natasha, I can empathize with the listeners who are more conservative, who are just like, whoa, now all of a sudden you're saying that this isn't terrible, that this isn't awful, that some of it's okay. And the thing you're not doing, Natasha, is just saying stay away from it, it's bad. And so many people, especially coming out of a Mormon context, are just going to say porn is bad. Kids shouldn't watch it. Tell them not to watch it. And tell them that it's evil and gross and perverted and objectifying. And you're not doing that, Natasha. Well, I would prefer for kids not to look at porn. I would, and I've told my kids that. I would prefer you not look at porn. And this is the point I had forgotten. I tell my kids, sometimes you'll see things in a movie, and I don't mean just porn. I mean like horror movies and super violent movies that, those images kind of can stay with you or they can influence you. And I would prefer for your first sexual experiences and as you get to know people that, you have somewhat not so many of those images in your head, that you can explore what you like and what you are excited about kind of more yourself. That would be my preference for you. That would be my ideal thoughts for you. at the same time, I have no control over what you're going to look at or not look at. So here's what I want you to know about those things. They're made up. They're not realistic all the time. They may, as you look at some of those things, they may be introduced into your erotic template. So some of those things you might enjoy doing because you've watched them. It's kind of like cooking shows again. I maybe wouldn't have put basil on my ice cream, if I hadn't seen somebody do it first, right? Now I kind of like it. So sometimes, yes, we are influenced by other people. If you see something that you're uncomfortable with or don't like, pay attention to that feeling. Know what that feels like. Know how to turn something off or find something different. Don't put yourself in positions where you're concerned or worried. And know that this whole realm of sexual exploration is somewhat normal. And then I also talk to them about themes that they're going to see that are not that healthy. I mean, it's very typical, for example, to see on Pornhub, young girl, teenage girl getting it on with her stepdad, or stepdad seducing, like incest type themes. So I talk to them about that. I say there are themes in movies and in porn and in music that are really unhealthy relational themes. And I would rather you not introduce that kind of stuff into your mind, because I don't think it's good for you. It's
and
not
so
good
if
for
we're
you.
talking, let's say that we all agree, and I do, that porn is not a healthy thing for kids and even adults. That first of all, there's a lot of porn that's just unhealthy. And let's just say we can debate about whether there's some healthy porn or not, but let's say we can all agree that we don't want our kids looking at porn. If we're talking about an effective approach, is just condemning it and scaring them and shaming them and trying to control them not the most effective approach if our goal is to minimize their porn use?
Yeah, it's back to your whole point about the anxiety feedback loop. When you forbid things, it's like the cookie jar.
Don't look in the closet.
Yeah, people are more drawn to it. Like, why, and then if they do look at it and they feel bad about it, then they can't tell you about it and they can't talk to you about it. And so then we give those themes a lot of power when we forbid them.
Gives it power.
We don't want to give porn more power than it deserves. Does that make sense? And I would say, moving away from kids, some people actually very much benefit from sexually explicit materials. Some couples really enjoy it. It's part of their kind of toolbox. Some women in particular who maybe are having a hard time becoming orgasmic need more like stimulation, intellectual stimulation for them to watch something erotic with their husband. It can benefit their relationship. So I don't like to say porn is bad or porn is good. I think it's like most things. It can be used in really awful ways. It can be used in really beneficial ways. You have to figure out how it fits with your values, how it fits with your lifestyle, whether or not there's benefits or risks, what outweighs what, and how you want to incorporate it or not incorporate it into your relationship with your spouse if you're married, for example.
And again, there's a reason why we titled this episode A More Effective Approach. I worked at university counseling centers, and I interviewed at probably 15 university counseling centers. And there's an epidemic at BYU, Provo, BYU, Idaho, and Utah State University that literally does not exist in any other university counseling center in the United States that I'm aware of, other than maybe some conservative evangelical Christian or Catholic ones. And that's this idea of kids coming to the counseling center, 18, 19, 22, and reporting, again, a pornography addiction. In other universities, in other states, in other traditions, they're not developing this pornography obsession and addiction at the same rates. Somehow, our Mormon approach in 2019 to pornography is actually making pornography viewing more common and more prevalent. Because in other traditions, secular and more liberal Christian and other traditions, it's just like, oh, porn, okay, I checked it out. I sometimes look at it. It's not a big deal. And it's not this all-consuming part of their lives at such a high prevalence rate. And in other university counseling centers, it wouldn't even be on the top 10 of presenting problems. It's only in these really hyper-conservative religious traditions generally where people become obsessed about sexuality and thus become, quote, addicts to porn. So again, I'm just trying to make the point that how we are approaching pornography is actually increasing its usage, and it's making it an epidemic when in other traditions it just wouldn't be that big of a deal. And I'm not saying that they just look at it obsessively, but they just don't think it's wrong. I'm saying they look at porn less because it's less stigmatized, less shamed, and less obsessed about. And so we have a porn epidemic in Mormonism because of the way we talk about and treat pornography.
Yes. And the research, there's been some recent research. Joshua Grubbs has done some excellent work showing that people in sex addiction treatment centers are usually actually acting out less than the general population, and yet are spending thousands of dollars and seeing themselves as diseased. So it's like, I often say, cocaine doesn't know if you're Mormon. Cocaine doesn't know if you're an atheist. Cocaine doesn't know if you're, Jehovah's Witness. It's going to affect everybody the same way. And you're going to, if you get addicted to cocaine, you're going to have to figure out some type of treatment approach. Pornography knows we're Mormon. It knows. Because other people who don't have the same stories and narratives and scripts that we have don't respond to it the same way we do. They don't have the same levels of marital difficulty that we do. They don't have the same levels of self-shame and treatments and people, like taking out a second mortgage for a $50,000 in treatment approach to porn addiction that doesn't even show any efficacy in working. I mean, it maddens me when my people are vulnerable and being taken advantage of in a certain modality or way of thinking because of where we come from and how we've been trained to think about certain aspects. So you don't have to like porn. You can see it as something that doesn't fall into your value system. That's fine. But please do it in a way that doesn't cause these kinds of problems, that exacerbates and makes everything worse in ways that just ends up harming everybody. It harms the spouse. It harms the person. It harms the kids. It harms our community.
Jeremy writes, I love this. We will definitely watch this with our kids. Great talking points. I love the idea of families watching Natasha Parker talk about these things. I also love, Natasha, that you shared a bunch of the links, talking to your kids about sex, 5 lies we've been told about porn, I'm out of control. These are all from Sex Talks with Natasha. And I'm just super thrilled you're sharing those. I'm going to ask Cody to include all these links when he makes the post. Okay, so let's change the subject slightly, Natasha. Let's talk quickly about, and we're not going to do it justice, but let's talk just quickly about approaching porn and masturbation in marriage. Because most of the time I see this as something that the males are confronted with wives that are concerned, and I know that's a false stereotype, but generally it's sort of like Mormon wife catches Mormon husband masturbating, or Mormon wife finds pornography in the history or catches the husband in the act of watching porn. Mormon wife shames Mormon husband, unrighteous priesthood holder, wicked, evil, dirty, perverted, unrighteous priesthood holder. I'm going to withhold my sex from you. We're not going to have a sexual intimacy until you stop. You're dirty. Go talk to the bishop. And it just becomes this major hurricane of stress and sadness in the marriage. Okay, that's not good. And then I hear Orthodox or conservative Mormons thinking, okay, well, what's the opposite? Where the wife just says, husband, look at all the porn you want, masturbate all you want. Even to the point of the husband not being available to his spouse because he's already satisfied himself and he would rather pleasure himself than be with the wife. And again, I'm 100% aware that that women look at porn too, and that women masturbate too, and that this dynamic often can happen in the reverse. I don't see it nearly as much, almost never, but it's important to, one, realize that I'm talking about dichotomies that are not reflecting reality for many people. But I've just given us two sort of extremes. One is like shame, guilt, awfulness, which we know is destructive, but then the opposite, which is everything goes and anything goes. And I think a lot of listeners are not going to be happy with that either. So how can let's say that a spouse catches another spouse either masturbating or looking at porn, what can be a way for them to talk about it and process it that can lead to health and more effective outcomes?
Yeah, so I think that, part of what you're talking about with differences of men and women is because we've been taught differently as men and women, as Mormons. And I think, covered quite a bit of this in our podcast, or the podcast that we just did about women in particular, and the challenges that they face as faith transitioners. We talked about the sexual messages that we get as women. And the reason why we see so much of the stereotype of what you're talking about with the man coming in as the naughty one is because it's not that women aren't looking at porn or reading erotic novels or reading, looking at erotic movies or being turned on by other things. It's just that we have very different narratives about how to respond as a woman and how to respond as a man to those types of issues. Because there really isn't as many differences as we'd like to think between men and women in regards to even drive and sexual tastes and things like that. So that's a lot of stuff that we've just been impacted by as far as what we've been taught to think. So I'll just start with that. As far as, what I would hope would be some ways that could be looked at differently. Again, if we have a more sex positive view of masturbation to begin with, I think from the very beginning, we stay away from an ownership mentality in a marriage. That somehow this romantic idea of you belong to me and I belong to you is really not a helpful approach to a long-term monogamous relationship. Because not only in the realms of sexuality, it's in the realms of any behavior that you act differently than I would want you to. Now we've got a big mess on our hands. And the reality is that marriage is all about that, because you've got two different people who are going to think differently. I mean, we think a lot the same because that's why we were attracted to each other, but there's always going to be differences in how we prefer to parent, how we prefer to spend money, how we prefer to spend a Sunday afternoon, how we prefer to be sexual. And so this idea that somehow if your behavior doesn't align with what I want, now it means that you don't love me, you don't prioritize me, I'm not important, I'm not sexy, I'm not attractive, or you're out of control, or you're frigid, or you're this, or you're that. I mean, we can get into so many meaning ruts that are so devastating to people when in reality, all it is that we're different, and we need to figure out that we can have good physical intimacy and good sex lives together, and yet not expect our partner to always be on the same page as us, because if that's your expectation, you're going to automatically fail at that just by the reality of life. And so I think masturbation can be used as a wonderful way to deal with libido differences, deal with erotic preference differences. It can be a way to deal with situational things like pregnancies or illnesses or surgeries, or things that come up where one of us isn't as sexually available as we are used to being. There's just lots of ways to be able to use masturbation. And the real tricks to that is to have that be part of your marital contract, that you both agree that as individuals, even though you are a partnership, you still have a right to your individual self. And that there's an aspect of your sexuality that your partner does not own. You do not own your spouse's sexuality. Just like I don't want my husband to own mine, I can't expect that I would own his. So he's maybe going to have sexual fantasies or ideas or thoughts or things that I am not going to have to be privy to, just like I would like to have some privacy. And in fact, what we know now through the work of people like Esther Perel and other sex therapists is that in order to actually have better outcome in monogamy, in other words, like you can actually be together with somebody for 30, 40, 50, 60 years these days because we're living so much longer, that's a long time to stay interesting to another person. And the reality is that if you can mix in a little bit of mystery, a little bit of not knowing absolutely everything about your partner, those relationships actually last, the desire and the eroticism in those relationships lasts longer and does better. So I think masturbation can be a wonderful way to have your own sense of sexuality, and there's no need for it to interfere with your coupled sexuality. Now, in the extreme case where you said, well, I would rather, go masturbate on my own than have sex with my partner, we'd like to blame masturbation for that. I would say that's not a masturbation problem. That's a conflict problem. Why is it easier to go masturbate by myself than to enjoy an evening or a nice, afternoon delight or whatever with my partner? And usually there's some type of either conflict or avoidance. There's some type of thing that's going on where a partner's either feeling shamed or worried or upset. And it may have to do with sexuality. It may not. I mean, if you're grumpy at each other for any type of reason, it may not feel very fun to go have sex together. Sometimes there can be some real sexual shaming themes in marriages, whether maybe a person is worried about erections. So I'd rather, I can go masturbate by myself, or I can go be with my wife who has a fit every time my penis isn't erect and thinks that I don't love her. And so, it's easier for me to go masturbate. Well, is that masturbation's problem? No, that's a couple relational erectile dysfunction problem that isn't being addressed. So I get very curious about why people are avoiding sexual contact with one another and would rather go and masturbate with the person. Because, your penis isn't mad at you. Your vulva and your clitoris isn't going to yell at you. It's easier to have a relationship with yourself than with another person. So why are we avoiding the relational sex? As far as erotic, erotic type of materials, I think, again, there's a part of that should be personal. And that can be really hard to get our head around that. If I want to read a novel that has a sex scene in it, I don't want my partner monitoring me on that. That makes me feel like a little kid. That makes me feel like a little girl that's in trouble. And I can tell you right now that that's probably the worst thing that can happen in my marriage is when I feel like a little girl in trouble. I go berserk when I feel that way. And I would think
others just disconnect. Others just disconnect. Mm-hmm. And stonewall and just become emotionally distant.
Yeah.
So we always quote you as saying, you never want to be married to your mother, your dad, your teacher, your parents, your boss. You want to be married to your lover, right? Your missionary, right? You want to be married to your lover. And so just the dynamic of policing your spouse's sexuality is toxic to your relationship.
That's right. And so if you have a sense of like, well, I think that this is a deal breaker, if you're going to do certain behaviors, certain sexual behaviors that don't include me, you may have to have a conversation like that. I would hope that pornography and erotic novels and erotic music would not be a deal breaker for most couples. I think that there are other types of sexual activities that could be deal breakers for sure for people, especially infidelity, serial infidelity, things of that nature.
So if a spouse comes to you, Natasha, and says it's infidelity, like he's looking at another man or woman, he's clearly finding them attractive and not me. He's clearly, that it's a rejection of me, but also it's cheating on me. What do you say to a spouse that feels like pornography viewing is tantamount to infidelity?
Yeah, well, people have a right to that opinion. And if they want to end a marriage over that opinion, that's definitely their prerogative. I try to see if there's any room for, instead of labeling as infidelity, as maybe betrayal. I think it is a betrayal when we
if there's an agreement not to do that.
Yeah, if you're kind of functioning, which as Mormons, we are doing that, right? We're kind of functioning with this sexual contract that the church has given us, right? The church gave us our marital sexual contract, and these are all the things we're not supposed to do. And I think a lot of people just assume that their partner's on the same page about that. And so I think there is a right in being upset about that and feeling betrayed and feeling like, you mean this has been happening for years? Or, I mean, secrecy is very, especially in your primary partnership, can feel very difficult and is a form of betrayal. I think there's a difference between secrecy and privacy, and you have to really contract together what the difference between those two things are and be on the same page about those things. And those are skills that none of us were taught. So the fact that you're coming to me in distress, I normalize that. I'm like, of course you're upset. Of course you're not happy about this. Of course you've been told, especially as women, that this is a direct, it's like a direct kind of inference on how he feels about you, that you're not sexy enough, that you're not pretty enough, that you're not good enough, that you're not offering enough in bed. And yet we now have research that doesn't support any of that. And so hopefully if they stick with me over time, we can reframe some of those things. And the person who's been acting in secret can take responsibility for the fact that they would have preferred to avoid conflict than to be really real about their sexuality. It's not just the one person that needs to change their mind about pornography. It's the other person who needs to be willing to be honest and talk about what that does for them and whether or not they really want to stop. A lot of times it's the classic, oh yes, I'll stop. And okay, but then we're in the same cycle, month after month after month. And I'm just saying, you're not being honest, that this is probably not something you really do want to stop. And so can we integrate this, and what would be difficult about that? And, but people astound me all the time in how they can recalibrate and relearn things and have new ideas, and how educating themselves and having the research that I share with them really move and become more flexible about these things, where it doesn't have to be that meaning at all. And in fact, their intimacy increases because now they're actually showing up together. They're not just pretending they're a certain sexual being. They're getting to know the sexual being that each of them really are. And that's not something that in Mormonism we teach or we even encourage. We encourage everybody to be a certain sexual being. This is how you should be. And most of us aren't that. And so then, I think both partners feel very inadequate and I'm sad for that. So I empathize a lot. I'm not here going, well, you need to change your mind about that. That woman usually has that perspective and those feelings for very legitimate reasons, just like he does, and how do we step back and recalibrate, and is there room for different ways of looking at this? And typically people who work with me are able to negotiate something different.
And what is a common outcome? What is a common approach, or when couples work with you, when they settle, when they learn to communicate, when they kind of when they normalize things, when they take the shame out, when they take the guilt out, when they take these assumptions around infidelity out, and they still have each other, they have themselves, and then they have the possibility of masturbation and pornography. I know there's going to be a wide variety of how couples end up, but give us a common scenario for where couples end up with porn and masturbation in their relationship and with their own sex lives once they take a healthier approach. How does this often end?
Yeah, so for some people, porn viewing and masturbation is a way to deal with libido differences, so for some men in particular might say, well, I never want to pressure or make my wife feel like she needs to have sex with me, or maybe I've tried to initiate and she's not in the mood, so then that's when I go and kind of take care of myself. So if you're needing help with negotiating libido differences, the reframing is that maybe that's an actually legitimate way to deal with a libido or erotic taste difference. And so we make room for that, but it's more in this honest space, and maybe he can approach her and she can be like, yeah, you're right. I'm not in the mood, or I don't want to, and I don't want to feel pressured into that. So now the fact that you're taking care of yourself isn't from the framing of that you don't love me or want to be with me or don't find me attractive. It's that you're honoring my libido and you're honoring my schedule and the fact that I'm exhausted and that I don't have energy for that tonight. And so that's one way. Other men or women use those kinds of things more for stress relief, and it doesn't really interfere. Like, that's something I'm asking all the time at the very beginning. If you didn't know this, would you have been upset with your sex life? And many people say, no, our sex life is great. There's nothing wrong with our sex life. And that's even why it's more confusing. So when I turn to the partner who's using some of these materials, I'm like, well, what's this about for you? Well, yeah, sometimes when I just feel stressed out, I just like to do this for 15 minutes or so. And it doesn't ever interfere with me wanting to have sex with my partner. And so those kinds of couples maybe just make room for that. It doesn't interfere with their sex life. Why can't somebody just, like, if I want to go to the coffee shop and have a Starbucks by myself and read the paper, why can't somebody else be, having a 10 to 15 minute solo sex session? It just doesn't interfere with how we come together. So then they reframe.
Or if I'm on a business trip, and I'm gone several days, and I certainly don't want to be unfaithful, but I need a release. There's just an understanding where you either do phone sex or you'll take care of yourself, and that's not a big deal. I have to add, in my case, when I came out to Margie and told her that I'd occasionally looked at porn or images, her response was, well, I love you. And, and we worked into this. This wasn't the immediate response was sadness and tears, because it wasn't, I think she felt like that wasn't, what we had understood. We had never really talked about it, but I think she had just assumed that wasn't something
talked about it.
That was going on. But once we kind of worked through those early emotions, the way we worked it out was, she said, listen, I'm not going to shame you. I don't think you're awful. I'm not going to tell you can't do it. But I want you to know that if you would like to make changes in our sex life or increase the frequency, I am more than thrilled and happy to accommodate and to increase our frequency or to try different things. Because personally, as your wife, if we can have a healthier and happier sex life, which would lead to you feeling the need to look at porn more, I'd rather be doing that with you than have you doing that alone. And so what it led to for us was just a better sex life. It was all uphill. Mm-hmm. It was just we have sex more often, and we have better sex more often, and that makes me just less interested in masturbation and porn, because I'm very happy with our sex life. And that doesn't need to be everyone's outcome, but that was the outcome with me and Margie, and I'm just being open and honest about that.
Yeah, and that's something that can happen. It's just, instead of, sometimes we assume things like, especially from this patriarchal position, my wife wouldn't be interested in that kind of sex, right? Or I don't want to sully my perfect, beautiful wife with doing this kind of sex type act or something. And then they talk about it and she's like, actually, that's super hot, or I'd love to try that. But again, we made a lot of assumptions. My only concern with that example is that there are women or men who really don't want to. And I wouldn't want anybody feeling pressured, right? Like, oh, now I have to be interested in these kinds of things so that they don't look at porn. And that's why I'm saying you don't have to be. You don't have to be interested. You're not going to be interested in everything the same way as your partner is. That's just a reality of being two different people. And so if somebody has a fetish or an interest or a kink or something that you really don't enjoy, erotic materials can be a wonderful outlet for that without, having to step outside your marriage. Or some people, negotiate non-monogamy for those kinds of issues, but that's a fairly, more drastic step, and many, many people don't want to do that. So why can't, I read novels. I have novels with, I remember reading Outlander. Lots of people like Outlander.
Watching the series.
Yeah, or watching the series. It's very erotic, and that didn't take away from me and my husband. That made me more interested in sexuality, and I'd actually lean into my husband after watching those episodes or whatever, which is actually what the research shows. The research shows that when people look at arousing materials, it's not that they don't want to be with their partners. They actually want to be with their partners more. They have more arousal. And where does that arousal go? Well, oh, you're my partner. I'd like that arousal to go to you. Or if I've watched a movie with Brad Pitt or somebody that I think is super hot, I don't go and try to find Brad Pitt's number. I'm going home to Andy and saying, hey, let's deal with my sexual energies together. And I'm not thinking about Brad Pitt either when I'm having sex with Andy. It's just, it got those juices flowing. And that's a lot of times what sexual explicit materials do.
I love that. And I also want to say in my case, even though I'm thrilled at Margie's response to my disclosure, technically it's not always going to be the spouse's job to satisfy the other spouse.
That's exactly right.
There are going to be situations where the spouse just isn't interested or isn't comfortable or doesn't want to always be the way that their spouse, achieves their level of frequency that they desire. And so spouses shouldn't be pressured to be responsible for their partner having all their sexual needs met if that's not what feels right to them.
That's exactly right. And that's why I think couples that can be like, oh, not tonight. Can you just take care of yourself in the shower or do your own thing? And the other partner's like, oh, no problem, honey. That's a wonderful moment. That's not a rejecting moment. That's a wonderful moment where they've negotiated something differently. And
you've even talked about a partner being with their partner while they take care of themselves, haven't you?
Yeah, that sometimes can happen with masturbation. It's like I'm not really into it or I can't offer you that energy, but I don't mind
holding you,
masturbate next to me, or if I hold you, or if I stroke your back while you masturbate, or get the sex toy out, or we don't have to be in the same willingness of eroticism to still be relationally willing, right? And every now and then leaning into relational willingness does start something. I can't tell you how many times I've been like, yeah, okay, let's have a quickie, and then halfway in I'm like, pause on the quickie. I'm more into this than I thought I'd be. So slow it down.
My turn.
Yeah. So it's just, I think the give and take and the not feeling like we owe each other or that we own each other is very important in long-term marital success, with realistic expectations and outlets where we can have some private sexual energy to ourselves, and then also share the majority of that with our partner is a really good equation.
Well, Natasha, it looks like we turned a 1 hour topic into a 3 hour topic.
And I could keep going.
Surprise, surprise. And I just want to make a plug for Natasha and for sex therapists. Like, if you're experiencing intimacy challenges in your marriage, and all do, if you're going through a midlife crisis, if there's an infidelity, if things just aren't as you want, you would hire a brain surgeon to do brain surgery. You'd hire a cardiologist to do heart surgery. Things like sexuality in a marriage or mixed faith marriages or whatever it is, need experts. And so hire Natasha, hire other therapists from what's the name of your Symmetry Solutions. Go to Mormon. Oh man, my brain's not working today. Mormon Mental Health Association. Mm-hmm. Go to Kristen Benyon. Go to any of the licensed sex therapists. Hodson, what's her name? Kristen
Hodson, Braxton Dutson, Shannon Hickman. Those are all people in Utah. And there's several that are undergoing training. Paige Vandersloot, she does excellent work. So most of those I think are on the Mormon Mental Health Association's directory. I've got several training under me right now at Symmetry Solutions, Lisa Butterworth, Jennifer White, Sarah Hughes Zabawa is about to start. So, I mean, there's lots of people that understand the cultural context, are trained or are under supervision and training to do this kind of work in effective, sex-positive ways. Because unfortunately, even in the profession of marriage and family therapy, I realized, even though I was very well trained in every other aspect I felt, I had a lot of biases going into sexual issues, even outside of Mormonism, just kind of in my training. So I'm very, very pleased that I got my sex therapy certification training, which really forced me to look at things much, much differently.
Yeah, so get an expert and get well. And again, you know, the bad news is we as Mormons have had a super dysfunctional relationship with sexuality. The good news is we can make it better. Mm-hmm. And so let's do it. My hard drive's running out of space, so I think we have to end.
All right. Well, that's one way to finish things off.
No, yeah. Well, Natasha, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. You're an expert. Tell us again your resources that people can consult.
So Mormon Sex Info is a great podcast, and I have so many things on there specifically about pornography if you want to delve more into that. Mormon Mental Health podcast, of course. Sextalkwithnatasha.com is where I have lots of webinars on lots of different topics, but all these topics that we talked about today. NatashaParker.org, I have a recommendations list there of books and things like that you can look at. ASECT, I've linked to that. It's just the National Organization of Accredited Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. Mormon Mental Health Association has a great list of providers, many of whom have been trained in sexuality. We have a position statement on MMHA that deals specifically around porn and sex addiction that might be helpful for some of you. Yeah, it's been my passion for so long. I've tried to create so many different things. I wrote a book called Check Your Baggage, which helps you kind of think about these messages that we grew up listening to and how to try to start shifting away from having those things affect you. What else can I think of? That's all this work I've done with you. I mean, we talk about sexuality a lot, and pretty much every time I present with you, I'm off in another room somewhere talking about sex. So
get help, get support, educate, talk, communicate openly. Good things will come.
Yes, they will.
So
come.
Natasha.
I just have to put in a little something. Keep it fun.
Thanks to all our listeners today who joined us. Thanks to everyone who supports the Gift of the Mormon Faith Crisis podcast through financial donations. Your donations make this possible. We don't have very many donors, and we could really use more support. So if you find this content to be useful or valuable, we would really, really appreciate your support. Go to mormonfaithcrisis.com, click on the donate button, $10, $50, $100 a month, whatever you can afford. It would really be useful to helping us be able to sustain and keep this going. Thanks to the Open Stories Foundation that makes all this possible. And, of course, thanks to Cody Layton, who does our audio-video production. We miss Margie. Shout out to Margie. We love you. We hope to see you soon. And also a huge shout-out to all our loyal listeners who join us, who make comments, who make suggestions. If any of you have any tips or questions or concerns or criticisms or ideas, we'd love you to email us at mormonfaithcrisis@gmail.com. Send us messages. Whatever you need to do. We would love to make this everything you need it to be. And if you have other topics you want us to explore, we'd love to hear that. Over the summer, our frequency is going to be a little bit spotty. Is that right, Natasha?